Ladies and gentlemen, that intro hasn't been played in a minute. Welcome back to Myth Vision. I'm your host, Derek Lambert, and I have a heck of a treat. I've got a great treat, a great treat from a really good friend, and I think a lot of you are going to enjoy his story. We're going to be talking about somebody who's gone through similar things to, I think, most of us who've watched this channel and are into the same stuff that we're into. And without further ado, let me introduce our guest, Paul Wallis. Welcome to Myth Vision.
G'day, Derek. It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you here. You've got a unique story. We've had a lot of offline kind of chit chats and got to know each other really well. I feel like you're a brother, and we have a shared interest in the same ancient world and all these things. And you have a YouTube channel. You also have the Fifth Kind YouTube channel. I put that for everybody to go subscribe and check out your channel. What's this channel? And then we got to talk about your book or your books. Sorry.
Well, the Fifth Kind is my larger YouTube channel. We're up to just behind 1.2 million subscribers there. And that's where I put videos that are designed really to attract people in to the subject area that I write to, which is world mythology and ancient narratives of contact, paleo contact. I have another channel as well, the Paul Wallis channel, that has a bit more of a theological, spiritual flavor to it. But in both channels, I'm really hoping I'm going to whet people's appetite for my book series, because that's where my real work is, in the Eden series of books.
Gotcha. And then you have your Amazon. I put the links in the comment or description. You've got several books: the Eden Enigma, the Scars of Eden, Echoes of Eden, Escaping from Eden, which is kind of hinting at what we're going through today.
Yep. And the Invasion of Eden, the Eden Enigma, the Eden Conspiracy. So it's 6 so far in the Eden series, all really approaching this question of paleo contact and ancient narratives from different angles and via the traditions of different cultures around the world. And then the other place I should mention is ancientknowledgeacademy.com. If you go there, you'll find that I'm doing classes that are deep dives into all the topics that I explore in the book series.
Remind me to add that to the description later in case someone's looking for it, because that's one thing I didn't add. Paul, this is your first time hanging out with me on stream, and
it is. I've eavesdropped on you many times, of course.
Same.
I'm a fan. I'm a fan of your work. I really enjoy what you're doing. I think it's really valuable.
Thank you.
But for me, I mean, this conversation we're going to have today is the first of a kind for me, because it's been back-to-back interviews for the last 7 years, but not talking about myself.
Yeah.
Not talking about my faith journey or my theology journey. Much more, I'm talking about paleo contact or current contact narratives. So this is a new experience. So you'll have to, if I go off into lecture mode, say, Paul, this is very interesting, but we're actually here to talk about something else, and you can bring me back onto script.
What I usually do, and it's pretty straightforward, is we go from cradle to where we are. And usually it allows everyone who's watching to attempt to understand, to try to find empathy or relation to your narrative. They may not fully understand, and some of the stuff that you say they will understand. But I think there's something about telling one story from childhood brings more humanity to the person and allows others to go, okay, well, they took different paths than me or whatever, but I understand like their heart. I see what they did in the paths they took, decisions they made, at least as brief as you can in a small live stream. So Paul, who is Paul? That's the question. What was your household like? Parents, religious upbringing? Can you give us a little bit of that background?
Yes, I can. So I grew up in England with my mum and my dad and my brother Mark, and a sequence of cats. My parents, at the time, growing up as a kid, probably most of us think our parents are fairly conservative people. And that was my general impression of my parents growing up. But now, looking back, I can see actually they were very intelligent, curious, curious minded, questioning people. And they were really very encouraging of my curiosity. And I think that was really the foundation for my life, encouraging an independence of thought, encouraging curiosity. And I'll tell you my earliest memory as it relates to what we're going to be talking about, because many of your guests will say that they began in the world of faith, which I didn't. We were not a Christian believing family. That was not us at all. I remember when I was very young going for a walk with my mum one day around the village, and we walked past some village hall, and she said, "Oh, they do Sunday school there. Would you be interested in going to Sunday school, Paul?" And because it had the word school in it, I knew the answer was no right away. So I said, no, I don't need to do that. Oh, that's fine. So that was the end of that discussion. We didn't go to church. We weren't Christian believers. But as I say, they encouraged my curiosity. And when I was 5, this is really when my deconstruction story starts. So a lot of your guests will begin in a Christian world, and then at some point, they'll see some clear blue water between what makes sense to them and what they're being presented with. For me, it was the other way around. I started off with skepticism, and I started off with a deep skepticism about religion. And my earliest memory on that track was from when I was 5 years old, and I was at school, and it wasn't a church school, but back in the day, this would have been the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s, even public schools, state schools, they would feel like church schools by today's standards, because we were praying, we were singing Christian hymns, so on and so forth. And so I remember one Monday morning, the principal came in, we were there all gathered for the whole school assembly, and she said, "Mrs. Clark's class are going to come in now. They're going to teach us a new hymn." And Mrs. Clark was the one teacher who could play the piano. So she always taught the hymns. She sat down with her class, and they taught this hymn that began with the words, "When Jesus was a little boy." The hymn went on to say that when Jesus was a little boy, he was good as gold. He never did anything wrong. He always obeyed his parents. He did everything his teachers told him to. He was completely faultless, and so children should you be. And that was sort of the message of the hymn. And I sat there at 5 years old thinking, this is pathetic. Do they really think we're so stupid as to not realize what they're doing? They are using the name of Jesus to try and get us to do what they want. And so this was my lesson in religious manipulation, in institutional religion at the age of 5. And I was really disgusted by it.
Now, until you read the infancy Gospel of Thomas, and then you realized they were really full of it.
Yeah, he wasn't good as gold after all. That's right. He was a murderer. No. So no, they didn't teach us that. That was not canonical, so we didn't look at that in infant school. It wasn't in our Bibles. But what happened was I went home to my dad and I complained about what had happened at school. And my dad was reading the newspaper at the time. And I said, "These teachers, they talk about God as if they know what they're talking about. But Dad, they don't know. They haven't met God. They haven't seen him. For all they know, he could be a giant green dragon." And Dad from behind his newspaper said, "Yes, Paul, you're probably right." And he may have answered that way because he was too deep in the Daily Telegraph to engage more fully. But those words mattered to me. "Yes, Paul, you're probably right," meant that he approved of my questioning. He approved of my curiosity, and he didn't come to the defense of the teachers. And that was my start point, that I was, from that point on, deeply suspicious of institutions that used the name of Jesus as if they were mates and as if they were the same thing. And that skepticism sort of stayed with me from that time to this. And it wasn't long after that, I had another experience, which I think also lay the foundations for my journey into faith and through faith. And it was, I just turned 7, I think. And Edward Windsor, who was Edward VIII, died. And so all of a sudden he was in all the newspapers. Now, he was the king who abdicated. You may or may not know this story. It was a great scandal. The only British monarch ever to give up the throne willingly. This is what happened in 1936. He gave up the throne to marry an American divorcee, Wallis Simpson, and shock, horror. It was a terrible constitutional crisis. And now, when I was 7, he had just died. Well, I didn't know any of this story. I didn't know who these faces were that were in all the newspapers and color supplements at the weekend. And I asked my mum and dad, who are these? Because their pictures absolutely fascinated me. And my mum and dad gave me an answer that really disturbed me. And it disturbed me because I could tell straight away these were not their thoughts. And these were not their emotions. What I heard coming out of my parents was really foreign to me and repugnant. And I just knew in my gut, these are not their own thoughts. And it was my first encounter with propaganda and with someone who has been propagandized. And I can tell you, my parents didn't maintain that opinion of those events. And all these decades later, we would read those events very differently and have an understanding of all the undercurrents and subterfuge and false narratives and disinformation that were being put out by official sources at the time. We would share a similar skeptical view. But at the time, they repeated the propaganda. And so I had a moment.
If I may, Paul, just to chime in on these, because this is important, just to relate to your story. Was there a sense in which that kind of scared you? Because for me, when my dad was overseas, because he was a soldier, my mom one time was at a flea market, not the same identical thing, but there was this guy who was selling crystals at a flea market. And he said he could somehow, he had a near-death experience from a car accident. He could predict the future and all this kind of stuff to my mom. And he was cold reading my mom and doing this stuff. My mom starts crying. And I felt very vulnerable. I didn't feel safe. I remember being a child feeling like, what's happening? My control system, my mom and dad, they are being manipulated here. If they're not stable, I'm not stable. Did that kind of relate?
Well, no, it's funny. My feeling was I felt angry with my parents because I knew these weren't their thoughts and that they had passed them on to me unfiltered. And I knew there must be another story here. So it sort of emphasized my need to be an independent thinker. But the reason I mentioned that in the story of faith is that it gave me perhaps an instinct for when someone is really speaking from the heart, telling you their own thoughts, or if they're reading off a script. Okay. If they're telling you something they've been programmed with.
I was reading
no, that's fine. It works at every level. But if you spend a lifetime in church-based ministry, that's actually something you're going to come across time after time. Mm-hmm. What does this person believe? What did they experience? And when are they simply rehearsing a script? And I get a lot of people in my inbox from day to day who are doing that. They're reading from a script and they see their whole raison d'etre within the world of faith as defending the script. They've been propagandized and their job is to propagandize me. I think these early experiences rescued me from being sucked sort of wholesale 100% into a community with a narrative and then lost my ability to think for myself. I think these really were the roots of what was to be my intellectual journey from those ages right to the present day.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. I was trying to see, I do get what you're saying. I was just thinking of a personal experience as you were going in. So you clearly saw people being gullible or sucked into propaganda with your family, with your dad and mom. You're about 7 years of age. So happily ever after, Christianity, you never become a Christian. I'm kidding. What happens to Paul after that?
Well, probably the next important thing happened when I was 11. And again, this is why I have to applaud my parents for encouraging my curiosity, because they had both read Erich von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods. And very subtly, they introduced me to his work. So they left Chariots of the Gods lying around the house. And I read it. And I found it really interesting. He's really the great granddaddy of the whole genre of paleo contact. But what he did for me in that moment was he got me asking bigger questions. It's a book full of questions. And I felt he'd put his finger on a real problem, our inability to explain ourselves as the alpha species on planet Earth. And I was finding the religious answer to how that was so totally unsatisfactory, because it seemed to neglect the obvious reality that was some kind of animal, which it doesn't fit really with the apple of God's eye special creation story. It didn't seem to give enough credit to what was obvious. And then the scientific answer lacks some things as well, because most of us left in the wild on our own are going to be sick or deceased after 3 days and 3 nights, unless we can build a shelter, light a fire, make a weapon. And the only reason we can do that is because of our higher intelligence. And I was finding a gap in our ability to explain exactly how this had been achieved. And that was the big question that I felt Erich von Daniken had put his finger on in that book. So it got me curious. Ultimately, it did lead me into the world of faith, but I read some other things when I was 11 too that kept me curious. And my mum got me a book, The Atlas of World Mysteries, that's right, by Francis Hitching, which was a book that sort of did a world tour and pointed at things that we can't fully explain. So it talked about the building of the pyramids. It talked about Velikovsky and the history of the solar system, the formation of planets, ideas about cryptids, all various, a whole collection of things. And rather than pushing a particular view forward, it just said there are things that are very mysterious that we can't fully explain. And so it kept me curious. My mum bought me another book, again when I was 11, called Supernature, which was a book about phenomena that we can't fully explain. And so this really lit my fire. I was now a full-on truth seeker. I wanted to know what was real. I didn't want to miss things other people were missing. I wanted to probe things, be a bit of a detective of life, really. But those big questions did lead me to asking theological questions. And so it was 6 years later, when I was 17, that I became a Christian largely through meeting some friends at school who evangelized me.
Ooh, tell us about it. I want to hear it.
Well, this would have been when I was in year 9, when I was about 14, that this process began. And I befriended some people who were born again Christians, evangelicals. They went to an Anglican church, but it was a church where a lot was happening. It had just intersected with Vineyard, with John Wimber. Perhaps some of the audience today will know John Wimber and the Vineyard churches. And I was hearing very interesting reports about what was going on at that church, stories of physical healing, rapid life change. My friends were constantly talking about what had happened at the weekend at their church. So I was a bit curious, but I was by now a really committed atheist. And so I did my best on a daily basis to talk them out of their faith. And I now know that one of my Christian friends was having regular counseling with his youth leader because my arguments were disturbing him so much. But in the end, as this very curious, truth-seeking person, I felt they have something that I can't put my finger on. I don't know what it is. Most of them, I can't argue them out of it. And they've got a vibe that I like, and I'm beginning to think that you can really only test Christianity as they understand it, which was a very experiential thing, from the inside. So am I willing to do that? And I thought long and hard about that. The only way I could allow myself to try it from the inside, try and be a follower of Jesus, was by thinking it through to the point where I realized there is clear blue water between the credibility of the figure of Jesus and the teachings associated with this Jesus, clear blue water between that and any institutional use of that story. Okay, so there's clear blue water between religion and the sources. And there's clear blue water between the sources and my Christian friends, because much as I like them, I didn't want to become one of them, if you see what I didn't want. I like things about them, but I still wanted to be this rigorous thinking individual person. I was not ready to surrender that. So it was only when I realized, okay, what I'm actually making a decision about is the credibility of the Jesus figure and the teaching associated with him. Am I willing to give that a go? And it was my yes to that that led me into the world of faith. And when I made that decision, I had some powerful experiences, much as other people were having in that church at the time. And so I learned the language to describe what these experiences were. And so it was the language of rebirth, being born again. It was the language of baptism in the Spirit. It was the language of being filled with the Spirit. Those were the things that happened immediately. And then, I mean, the experiences came first. And then I had to be taught how to describe them. And I find there's a really important distinction, because many people I get into conversation with through the Paul Wallis channel, through the Fifth Kind, people who come to my website, many people who are doing a deconstruction, making a deconstruction journey, are having to get their head around real experiences that they had en route. What does that mean? Because they'd always interpreted these experiences through a tight Orthodox Christian lens. Do they have to deny they had these experiences, or is there another way of understanding them? And so there was a time when, if someone had asked me, so what did happen, you know, when you made that decision to follow Jesus? There was a time when I'd have said, well, I had a powerful encounter with the risen Lord.
Yeah.
Because those were the words I'd been taught to use. But now, when I think more carefully about it, what happened? Did I encounter a human being? Did I encounter a reanimated human body? Did I encounter an individual? What did I encounter? And if I get down to what actually happened, I had a profound experience of light that is very hard to explain, a profound experience of unconditional love that is very hard to explain, a profound feeling of peace which stayed with me. And, you know, the mind of a teenager is a very noisy place, full of thoughts and anxieties and paranoias. All of a sudden I had this amazing serenity about me. So something had happened. Now, of course, that I'm describing what actually happened, I realize all kinds of people with all kinds of beliefs from all kinds of cultures have experiences like this. And to describe it as I met the risen Lord doesn't do justice to how much of a human experience this is. This is very much a part of the human experience, the experience of mystics from any and every religion and no religion. So I'm able to go back to these experiences and say, yes, I had these experiences. Yes, they were powerful. Yes, they were life-changing. But realize that those experiences don't equate to the religious orthodoxy that I was being entrained in from that moment on.
I can totally relate. And I can't even count how many experiences in my life. Again, the way I explain it, because a lot of Christians will come across me and they will go, you claim you knew the Lord, right? You know how you said you encountered the Lord, right? You claim you knew the Lord. Based on your descriptions of your experiences, you did encounter him. How can you turn your back once you've encountered the Lord? And notice everything's couched within the experience equates the theology, the conclusion. And for me today, I'm like, I've had so many experiences, even in the last 7-8 years, as I call myself a non-believer. I've had profound human experiences when the right song hits, when the sun is hitting the waters on the ocean, and I'm there with my family, or there's moments with my wife that are romantic, and there's human moments where things hit, and I'm just like, I remember that when I would say it was Jesus, but I'm having it without any of that. So it's amazing.
What saved me from really narrow tribalism on this was going to university, really, because I started meeting people, beyond my youth group and beyond my friendship circle. And it was really from that moment on that I realized there were people completely outside the faith who were having very, very similar experiences, whether we were talking about experiences like the ones I described, or experiences of healing, or what we as charismatic Christians would call the word of knowledge. These are experiences that don't belong. There's no monopoly on these things within the church. And I realized somehow God must be much, much bigger than this orthodoxy that I was being taught. And very quickly after I became a Christian, this really was an important experience for me. The church I went to, because I joined their church, because so much was happening. It was a great place to be. It was a very experiential version of Christianity. Why would I go anywhere else? So I went to their church. They had two wonderful pastors. The senior pastor was, in fact, a Church of England bishop, Bishop David Pitches. And the number two was the Reverend Barry Kissel. And they were wonderful pastors, very invested in me. They were great mentors to me. And I hung on their every word. But after about a year, I realized somehow that the two of them disagreed on a point of theology. And it was a point of theology that I thought was pretty important. And if I remember correctly, it was infant baptism. So in the Church of England, in the Anglican Church, which is the church I got ordained into, we baptize babies. That's the Anglican tradition.
Right.
Plenty of Christian traditions say that's not really what the New Testament means by baptism. We're going to do it the New Testament way, and we baptize adults as a mark of their becoming Christians or owning their faith in a personal way. And I think David might have been the infant baptizer and Barry might have been the adult baptizer. I think it was that issue. It might have been a different one, but it was something as important, so I thought, as that. And when I realized that my two heroes, my two oracles of the faith, I've been hanging on their every word, disagreed, it was a wonderful signal. And they were open about it, because I talked to David Pitches about it. And I remarked, they're still friends. They're both teaching at the same church. They work together beautifully. And they hold different opinions. It was a signal to me, again, I have to retain my own mind. I'm going to have to make up my mind as to who's right here. They can't both be right. And it was a signal that the journey of faith doesn't end by signing up to a set of 10 conclusions, and those are the conclusions you keep for the rest of your life. You have to remain a truth seeker. You have to look at things for yourself. You have to keep on thinking. And that was the signal that I took from that experience.
Did the infant baptizer try to, if you can remember, try to make the argument that baptism replaced circumcision so they could include children in the way that they used to circumcise children? So there's a replacement of it. That's what they did for me at the Presbyterian Church. When I first heard about this, I was like, you not only do you not dunk, typically you sprinkle. Depending on the tradition, they usually would like sprinkle the water on them, but they replaced circumcision for infants.
Well, there would have been people in my church who had that theology. And there would have been people in my church who would have been more at the sort of brethren end of the perspective, where faith really does equate with being able to rehearse certain doctrines and persuade people that you really believe them. But The clergy weren't like that. David and Barry weren't like that. And in fact, David baptized me as an adult. But as a good Anglican, when I said I wanted to be baptized, he said, well, were you baptized as a child? Because, you know, Anglican law says if someone's been baptized as a child, then you can't adult baptize them. But my answer was, no, I haven't been baptized. No, my parents aren't believers at all. And so I started doing the baptism and confirmation classes, which would sort of rolled into one ceremony a few weeks later. And it was on the last day of the baptismal preparation that I mentioned to Mum what I was doing. Mm-hmm. And she said, but you were baptized as a baby. I said, what? What did you do that for? Why would you do that? This is not a Christian believing church going family. Why did you do that? And she said, well, it's how you give a baby a name, isn't it? And I thought, oh gosh, what am I going to do now? But bless him, David was a bad enough Anglican to say, oh, we'll forget about that. We'll just baptize you from scratch. So that's what happened.
So just so I have this correct, you're how old now, and you're listening to two of your heroes not agree on baptism. That, you know, they were kind about it, but it had to make you go, huh? You know, clearly you're like you said, you have to keep searching, keep seeking. If they can't figure this out, how old are you, and what takes place from there?
I think I would have been 18 when I had that conversation with David Pitches. And initially, it was like having my armbands taken off in the swimming pool and having to swim without any flotation devices. I felt, oh, okay. But because I'd had all this wonderful preparation from my parents, turning me into this curious-minded person, there was actually something quite vivifying about it. That I could carry on being a seeker. I could carry on being this detective of life, thinking for myself, that I didn't have to surrender that in order to have a journey of faith.
Interesting. Okay. And you are now a committed Christian. Clearly you've been now for years, and you're learning from these guys. What do you end up moving into leadership? Like, are you like everything's interpreted through the lens of Jesus mainly still in your life at this moment?
Yes. Well, I moved fairly quickly into the world of ministry. So 17, just before my 17th birthday was when I had that born again experience. Mm-hmm. And then when I was 20, I was doing my first job as a pastoral assistant at a church in London. So yes, that happened quite quickly. I had, though, questions.
Yeah.
Because again, this curious mind, I came into the world of church and into the youth group, and I was avidly reading the whole Bible. In fact, I read very, very quickly. And so I had some early questions. And one was, we seem to invest a lot of time and energy on a weekly basis in our church to putting on services. Where's that in the Gospels? I'm not finding it. Why are we doing that? Did Jesus actually teach us to do that? Why is what we are doing so different to what I'm reading? And they struggled to answer that question. And it was a question that stayed with me. And then the other question was, I'm having a problem getting my head around this hell teaching. Apparently, the punishment for not becoming a Christian in the way I had was that when you die, God will bring you back to life so that he can set you on fire, but he will keep you alive so that you'll be in agony forever. Can you show me that in the Gospels? Because I'm not finding it. And again, I wasn't getting satisfactory answers. I was getting propagandized answers, people reading from a script, but nothing that really met my problems, because I'd actually read the texts. I'd actually read the Gospels and found there's a gap between what's in the Gospels and this very developed church teaching. And when I went to theological college to train for ordination, which happened when I was 22, I had some personal agendas for my study while I was at college. And my first agenda was to work out where this hell doctrine came from, what its merits were. Was it a fair reading or development of what was in the New Testament? Or was it one of these institutional things that really stands quite separate from the texts and what this figure Jesus actually said and began with?
Mm. Yeah.
And I found, just to jump to the punchline, no, there is a gap. There is a gap.
Right.
That Jesus talks about something else. His teachings really are about avoiding destructive and self-destructive behaviors that will ruin your life and end you up on the trash heap of life, Gehenna, full of remorse and unable to undo the things that you've done. That's really what it seems to add up to. Once you go to the text, read them closely, and do the translation work, because I found that when I went to the texts, they were full of words that we have layered later meanings onto. So there's this little Greek word that gets translated as judgment. And as soon as an English person reads the word judgment, all these doctrines of heaven and hell click into place. They're not in the text. They're in the reader's mind. And so these were some of the distinctions I was learning to make.
So you're a minister. You're working to become a minister. You're going to school. You're now discovering some of the doctrines institutionally don't seem to match what you found within the material text. And are you now teaching? Are you having discussions about these ideas with people of faith in, authorial positions and stuff?
Well, I had 3 years of opportunity to do that at theological college, really teasing out all these theological questions. But something else was happening to me at the same time. So on the one hand, there was this skeptical, questioning, curious Paul. But on the other hand, I was all fired up as a brand new believer. Yeah. I was excited about the experience I was having, and I wanted to evangelize the world. And so part of me was actually wanting to become a propagandist, or what Christians would call an apologist, so that I could go out and not only evangelize and convert people, but for the skeptics to listen to me and say, oh, he sounds sensible. He makes sense. I wanted to be really the best apologist that I could be. Now, classically, of course, an apologist is someone who shows the reasonableness of faith. Right. And I certainly wanted to do that, but I think I slipped into the Mickey Mouse version of an apologist as well. I was only young, after all. And the Mickey Mouse version of an apologist is someone who gathers together all the evidence they can and arguments to support their orthodox view, and any other data, they will find ways, fair or foul, to dismiss them so that they don't come into the conversation. Because my agenda is I want to show Christianity is right. I want to get people to become Christians. And so this, unfortunately, slightly distorted my experience of study for those 3 years. On the whole, it was a wonderful experience. And I'm so grateful for the University of Nottingham, which had a wonderful theology faculty, very grateful for St. John's College, Nottingham. But what happened was we had to write dozens of essays as part of that degree, and you could pick your topic. And so you could pick to avoid certain topics if you wanted to. And what I wanted to do was train myself up as a propagandist, as an evangelist. So when in my studies, I was forced to confront the reality, or what was accepted by academia, that many of the biblical stories of Elohim and Yahweh, the stories we take as God's stories, many of those stories are dependent on another culture's stories of sky people. I didn't write an essay on that. So when we were forced to read handouts that said the flood narrative, probably based on the Sumerian Babylonian narratives of Yisudra, Utnapishtim, Archdeacon, it's there in the Epic of Gilgamesh. I would sort of note that in my essays just to show the lecturers I had read the notes, I did know this, but I certainly did not pursue it because I thought that's not going to help me. That is not going to help me at all in my preaching. So I'm not going to write an essay on it. I'm not going to explore it any further. And that was dishonest of me, really, because it's extremely significant that there is a dependence on the earlier Mesopotamian stories. It's extremely significant that the Mesopotamian stories are not about God. It's extremely significant that the word Elohim doesn't translate as God, that Yahweh behaves in a way that is ungodlike in the early texts, but I ignored all that, didn't write essays on it because I wanted to be an apologist. And it took me years and years to get back to those questions and think, no, actually, I do need to look at that.
So you're in your 20s, you're sincere. They're telling you to look at this. So you're telling me they are telling you to look at the Mesopotamian background. But you don't really hear sermons by people telling you Genesis is. So what's going on here? Is this the secret knowledge of the archdeacons here?
This is oh dear. Yeah, this really, to me, this is a scandal. And it is a big part of what has motivated me to write Escaping from Eden, The Scars of Eden, Echoes of Eden, The Eden Conspiracy, The Invasion of Eden, The Eden Enigma. They're all driven by this outrage that it was in the 1800s that academic Assyriologists and theologians realized that there was this dependence. It was in the 1830s that people like Henry Rawlinson, George Smith began working with the cuneiform tablets, translating them and recognizing the dependence. It was in 1876 that George Smith published the Chaldean account of Genesis, and it became part of conversation at an academic level. And yet I get so much pushback from people who, particularly not necessarily who read my books, but who hear me speaking on The Fifth Kind on YouTube or on the Paul Wallis channel. And there will be sort of rank and file members of churches and saying, you can't say that. You can't say the Bible's based on Mesopotamian literature or Ugaritic literature. You can't tell me that if we come to the New Testament, that the Gospels and New Testament are part of the Greco-Roman world. This is blasphemy. Yeah. You are debunking Christianity at a fundamental level, and you deserve to be set on fire and kept alive for eternity so that you can suffer for the things you're saying. And they have no idea. This has been part of academic conversation for a very long time. And to me, it's a scandal that these discoveries were being made. Well, in 5 years' time, it will be 200 years ago. Mm-hmm. And this knowledge has made its way to the universities, to the seminaries, but there's a problem getting from seminary to congregation. And the problem isn't always the unimaginativeness or the cowardice of pastors and clergy. Very often, it is the polity of churches that is the problem. It's the social dynamics of communities of faith. Because if you go to a church that is an associational church, that has a doctrinal basis, if you go there as your pastor, your job, as you will be reminded, is to police the thought life of the congregation to make sure we don't depart from these 12 fundamental truths. And the board won't be interested in what you learned at university or theological college. You're not free to go in there and talk about your beliefs and how they're evolving, because what you believe, Derek, is irrelevant. And what I believe is irrelevant. Your job is to talk about what we believe. We, this church, we, this congregation, we, the denomination, we, this tradition. An individual belief, there's really no room for individuals having beliefs in doctrine-based churches. And if the pastor starts departing from the script, challenging questions of biblical inerrancy, for instance, then the board will quietly say, Pastor, I don't think you can continue here because you don't believe the same things we do. And so the theological agenda isn't being set by those who've got the degrees. It's being set by the boards and congregations who want their pastor simply to rehearse the old familiar stories. And so I've experienced a bit of that kind of pushback in the life of the church. All pastors want to develop the intellectual life of their congregations, but very often those congregations will dictate terms. I do find, just to say a word in defense of my ordaining denomination, that the Anglican Church, the Episcopalian churches in the States, have a bit more breadth, because we don't have to ascribe to a set of 12 fundamental truths to be ordained or to be a warden or a church counselor or to go to those churches. And I have found more a kinder response from pastors and clergy in those worlds when they read my books. But as an illustration of just how powerful these social dynamics are I was talking about, I've lost count of the number of pastors who've contacted me, and the largest contingent has been Baptist pastors who said, Paul, I've been in ministry for 40 years and I retired last year, and I started reading your books and I've come round to your way of thinking. And one of these pastors said within 6 months of being retired, he'd come round to my way of thinking. Now that tells you that he had no freedom in 40 years of pastorates to follow his own curiosity or to talk about his own beliefs. For 40 years, he had had to stick to that propaganda, to that script, and his personal questions and curiosity had to be on the back burner. As soon as he was free to go back to the texts with a clear conscience and no obligation to be in church on Sunday with his theology all wrapped up, then he was able to start thinking fresh and see there are other things going on in the biblical text that never get preached, that never get talked about. All these anomalies and taboos that have simply not entered onto the preaching roster of the churches in 200 years. And I think that's the scandal we need to address.
I tell you, just to relate to what you said, when I went to an evangelical college, because I was going to go into seminary to become a pastor, even within 2 years of getting an associate's degree at this little fundamentalist Baptist evangelical college, my mind changed theologically so much within just 2 years of being in this little college, because they'd have me read stuff, but then I would also open commentaries and I'd be reading from guys from 300 years ago, 400 years ago, some of the church fathers. And I'd be like, this is really different from what they're telling me at the church, college.
Oh, yes.
And in my mind, I had struggles with addiction as well. It's a whole nother thing that kind of caused me other traumas and anxieties in life. But I will say that there was in the back of my mind this fear that if I finally get to, and I have become the thing I said I wanted to be, because that's what they all do, is you go down, you walk this path, you get up here, you become this thing, you become a pastor, you stand in front of people, you're this authority, you're a teacher. My worry was that what if I end up going into a particular church, because it's just how they are. They have boxes you have to enter in order to become whatever their leader is that I change my doctrine again after keep studying because I'd never stopped growing. And now I'm a pastor of a church I don't even agree with the doctrine in, or I have a changed view of whatever it might be. Now I've screwed myself. And there are a lot of people, I know you know this, but there are a lot of people even that have reached out to like Freedom from Religion Foundation and stuff like that, who are working as priests, as pastors, as imams, the whole nine, various religious people who no longer believe the thing that they are in, and they have to for their job, but they have to hide it. So they're getting therapy. They're trying to figure out.
Oh, yes, I know.
It's wild.
I talk to a lot of people in that place. So it'll be serving pastors asking me that question, but also a lot of ordinands, a lot of people who are being trained for ordination. in the churches who will come across these issues while they're at seminary and think, well, how do I move forward? Do I believe enough of the stuff to carry on and get ordained? Mm-hmm. And if I do, what do I do with this other information that's taboo? How do I handle that? And it's not always the same answer that gets given, because different churches operate different ways. As I say, in the Anglican Church, you can make an intellectual journey, and you can share that journey through your preaching, sensitively, tactfully, selectively. But there are other churches where it's going to be very painful from the get-go. For instance, if you can't affirm biblical inerrancy, there are churches you just would be ill-advised to get ordained in. If you hold a different view, that's not going to work out well. And so my ideas of the Bible changed. In my 3 years, I had never been an inerrancy person, because at youth group, they couldn't make a case for it. And then, of course, at theological college, you study the history of the formation of the Bible, and you realize this is a far more complicated story, and it's much more a story of the church than a story of the scriptures themselves. And also, you're forced to engage with the texts and see they just don't work that way. They are not that kind of literature. I mean, two things come to mind. I remember reading up on the early debates of Christianity and the work of people like Marcion in catalyzing the formation of the New Testament canon, and then Origen in working out how Christians should handle this Bible that's now got the Hebrew scriptures glued onto it. And you read these histories briefly, and it seems to be a history of Orthodox saints and heretics. But read enough history and you'll realize that the heretics very often didn't get a fair hearing. And often you'll come across heretics and think, wait, but aren't they making sense?
Yeah.
And in the Origen Marcion thing, that was very much the case, because Marcion confronted head on, there are things in the Hebrew scriptures that cannot possibly be accurate stories of God if we believe in Jesus. If we believe God is as Jesus is suggesting, then we have to reject these awful, monstrous stories, don't we? And I think he was very honest about what the problem was. Origen, who for a while was an Orthodox church father, he was the founder of Christian hermeneutics. He accepted about 90% of what Marcion said. And this is what we miss when we read things too quickly. He totally accepted there was a massive problem. And so he came up with this trialectical hermeneutic to help preachers avoid the problem. And Origen would say, if we take all these stories of Elohim and Yahweh at face value as if they're God's stories, then we would have to believe of God such things as we would not believe of the most savage and unjust of men. Mm-hmm. So we know that's wrong, he's saying. So what are we going to do with that text? If you can't use the plain reading, he says, look for the soul meaning. This is the moral of the story. So forget what the story is actually saying. Is there a moral you can put into your sermon? And if the moral is absolutely repugnant, I mean, if you've just read Leviticus 10, where Yahweh has burned 2 young men alive in front of their father because he didn't like the present that they gave him, what's the moral of that story? Well, according to the subheading in my, I think it's New Jerusalem Bible, that's a lesson in exact obedience. Is it? Is that right? Is that what you're going to preach? God's going to set you on fire and kill you if you try and please him, but produce an incense that he doesn't like? Well, if that doesn't work, Origen says you go to another meaning. You go to the spirit meaning. Look for a prophetic meaning, something that's about Jesus and the church. So this way of approaching texts is the way almost all pastors preach. If the plain meaning is nonsense or repugnant, what's the moral of the story?
Right.
So, brothers and sisters, what's the moral of the story? What is the spirit meaning? And that's why in the church, This is what, whether you're a liberal, a fundamentalist, an evangelical, a charismatic, everyone handles the scriptures that way. Origen pioneered it, but you go back and you read Origen, other than in little handouts, read his actual writing, you'll realize this is a lesson in how to avoid the obvious problems with the Hebrew texts if you're going to interpret them as God's stories. And that contribution, I think, has largely been forgotten. But going through all that, you cannot come away fundamentalist if you're doing your studies properly. And so college did me that very great favor.
You're helping me get you back on track, in fact, by saying that. So because we're having too much fun, and we can do this again, of course, and go off the tracks. But this is your story day. So here you are. You're very committed. Obviously, even the institutions you're learning at are aware and are encouraging you to learn about the Mesopotamian background. You're going headlong into the mission for Christ. What did you graduate? Did you become like a leader of a local church? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
I did graduate. I did get ordained at St. Paul's Cathedral. I celebrated my first, we called it a mass, because in my type of Church of England church, we were really, our liturgy was very Roman in style. And my first mass as a priest was celebrated in a church that was already there in AD 314. So we were very, very proud of the antiquity of our traditions. I started off there as an assistant curate. And then my next job, from the age of 28, I was in senior pastor positions. And so I spent the next decades leading churches, planting churches. When I was a brand new convert, I prayed this prayer and I said, God, send me to churches that need help. I don't want to go to churches that are all running fine, they're absolutely happy. I want to go to churches that really need help. I want to be like a church doctor, because I'd met people who did that kind of work. Eddie Gibbs did that kind of work. John Wimber for a while did that kind of work. I wanted to do that kind of work. And now that I look back on my church career, I realize that's what happened, that my pastoral assignments were very often church doctoring assignments, whether that was as a church planter, a church that can't get going or that needs starting something new from scratch, or as an intentional interim where you go in for community healing over a couple of years to solve endemic problems that perhaps have repeated over decades that have got to be fixed before the next pastor comes. That's what an intentional interim does. And as an archdeacon, which is one down from a bishop in the Anglican system. And again, that's a bit of a troubleshooting, problem solving, community healing kind of job. You're involved in appointments processes, you're oversighting clergy. So it was all that kind of work. And some of it was really full on. The exciting end of that spectrum was planting a church from scratch. And I was involved in church planting 6 times through my church career. And then the challenging end was community healing, where you're having to deal with governance problems, polity problems, but then also there's a spiritual layer to the trouble some communities get into that involves entity removal. And so I was working with specialist exorcists and people like that to get into situations that were really very dark and that were very stretching to my neat and tidy worldview. So it was full on, and all the work I did sort of put me in a place where I was very, very dependent on a sense of connection with God, a sense that I was getting guidance, wisdom, information from God. And so because the work was so stretching, it really kept me in that experiential place of faith where I'm really looking at getting very direct divine help to do the things that I need to do.
So how were you then in this position for how long were you leading and doing this?
33 years in church-based ministry doing that.
Wow. That's quite a long
And it was It was for Anglican churches. It was for independent churches. It was for what a few years ago we talked about as emerging churches, neo-monastic communities. So it was quite a spectrum of experience.
Wow. Okay, so you've gone through, I'm sure you've seen everything under the sun just about in terms of human experiences of people coming in, people leaving the faith, I'm sure. Did you ever have anyone come up to you during this time inquisitive, and you didn't quite find your way outside of the institution anymore, but they had questions? You could tell looking back, you're like, they were already on this path. You could tell, like, people you were bumping into along the way. You know what I mean?
I don't know about that. I can't think of anything, but I'll tell you that all through that experience, my life was social enough and gregarious enough for me to continue realizing that the interesting and special experiences I was having were not the monopoly of the church.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was this constant challenge of reality is a little bit bigger than you're seeing it, Paul. And funnily enough, I think the thing that really began, two things really began busting my neat and tidy theology. Well, maybe it was three things looking back. I remember a moment when the problem of suffering really impacted me. And I mean the theological problem of suffering. If God is loving, if God is almighty, then why did this and this happen?
Mm-hmm.
And as an apologist, I always found a way to push that question to one side. I would always imagine that there was some greater good that was being served by the free will that had allowed this situation, or the randomness of creation that had allowed all these accidental deaths. But I just remember one week where in the news, there were 3 stories of things that had happened to babies and toddlers that were just horrible. And I knew I couldn't answer that question to my own satisfaction, let alone anyone else's. And in that moment, I realized that something about my idea of God had to be wrong. You know, the theological problem of suffering begins with an if. If God is loving, if God is almighty, ... then there's a problem. Well, what if there's a problem with the if? And that was the first moment I really allowed myself to think that my whole idea of God is wrong, because there is no way to accommodate this. There is no way to see a greater good arising from these particular things that have happened. And I'm not going to pretend there is. And so that really sat with me, challenging me to expand my view. And then another thing that challenged me to expand my view. Go on.
Was that God just ringing your doorbell? Just kidding. Just kidding. Okay, please continue.
No, I think God is happy for me to be on your channel. That's being attended to. So that was one thing. And then another was, I do it in order. And then perhaps about 4 years after that, I was really wrestling with the question of whether we are alone in the universe or whether we're in a populated universe. And I had been following the colloquium that was convened in 2009 by the Roman Catholic Church. Now, again, I should stress, I've never worked for the Roman Catholic Church. I don't particularly follow the edicts of popes, but I couldn't help noticing when the most conservative pope in my lifetime called on the Pontifical Academy of Sciences to convene a colloquium. So this is a symposium of top theologians and scholars and experts to gather together to discuss the implications of contact with other civilizations, the theological implications. And yes, they really did mean ETs. And there was a big build up to this colloquium. And so we were hearing from very eminent figures representing the Curia, people like Father Jose Gabriel Funes, the director of the Vatican Observatory, Monsignor Corrado Balducci, who is the Vatican's senior expert in paranormal ministry, exorcisms, so on and so forth. And then the Reverend Dr. Guy Consolmagno, senior astronomer for the Vatican. And they were all saying the same thing in the lead up. They were saying we shouldn't be surprised to find ourselves in a populated universe. There's plenty of evidence for it. We should be ready to embrace a brother or sister alien, was the language they were using. And Guy Consolmagno said we shouldn't be surprised because there's ET life described in the Bible, in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And this was clearly, and they repeated the same messages after the colloquium. And this was clearly an invitation for people to go back to the text and read them again and ask, all right, so where are these other kinds of entity washing around in the text? That got me curious, and it got me listening to Ed Mitchell in particular, the sixth man to walk on the moon. And as I began thinking through these questions, does Christian theology rule out life in other parts of the cosmos? And bit by bit, I came to the conclusion, no, it doesn't rule it out. And I've seen enough other things to persuade me we're not alone. And this again forced me to come back to my idea of God, because if the universe isn't empty, with only human beings as the apple of God's eye, it changes how we think of God. It has to. God stops being this anthropomorphic figure, stops being humanity writ large, stops being Santa Claus for the human race, and is clearly something bigger. And so this was beginning to expand my consideration of possibilities about what God is. And then the third thing that happened that began blowing up my worldview was, as I said earlier, I was always dependent on God in my work. I was always looking for words of wisdom, words of knowledge. And all through my ministry life, I'd had this experience that I would call the word of knowledge, which is where suddenly you have a batch of information in your mind. You have no idea where it came from. So just as an illustration, early on, I remember I was doing door knocking when I was working in London. And before I went which I hated, and before I went door knocking, I had an image that flashed into my mind of a red door, a red Georgian style door with a brass number 63 on it, and a woman opening the door who had pale skin, long black hair. And I knew that she was a psychic, but I knew that she was anxious, and her anxiety related to the younger male person in the apartment behind her. All this just came into my mind. And it's as if it just feels like suddenly you know this thing. And sure enough, when I went out on the doors that afternoon, in a block of flats where all the doors were blue, oh, there's a red one. Oh my goodness, it's number 63. And then everything unfolded exactly the way I'd seen. Now, the way I processed experiences like that was in the Orthodox charismatic worldview. So God is separated from the world in that worldview. And in order to get to the world and help the world, he works through the Christian, and only the Christian, because only the Christian has the Holy Spirit and can get this kind of wisdom to help people. That's how I processed that kind of experience. But following the colloquium experience a few years after that, I started getting more and more of these words of knowledge that were totally random, that didn't relate to anything to do with the gospel or ministry. And it was blowing open that paradigm of Christians as this funnel for God's power. It didn't fit into that paradigm. And I began thinking, am I just experiencing something that is a human experience, that is a human ability that we all have, that we're all sensitive in some kind of a way, that maybe some of us don't pay a lot of attention to it, but perhaps we human beings pick up a lot of information, more information than we think. Is this really something bigger? And again, that brought me back to my idea of God. My vision of God stopped being church-based and started expanding. And by the time those things had happened, I knew I had to do some more fundamental work to challenge where my ideas of God had come from, how I'd come to these conclusions, and whether they related to reality at all, or if I'd missed something huge, which I think I had.
You know, it's really interesting how both you and I have in our stories went from a very narrow kind of box about deity to an expanded concept of whatever that may be. We might have tried to put labels on it, but it starts to expand and it's no longer confined by the dogmas, the borders, the boxes. And of course, I'm kind of wanting to maybe get to what happens that makes you leave and how did that happen? What was there drama? What took place? How did you leave nice? Everything's okay? Or what happened? Because in my journey, and I'm just speaking from my personal experience, is I started to go down a more naturalist road, a more, I guess you could call it a materialistic, naturalistic kind of worldview to explain the world instead of going and experimenting with different kinds of faith-ish or belief systems. And yet, before I got to that place where I am now, currently, my understanding of God did expand quite large to the point where it was like the famous quote, my favorite is the 6 wise men of Hindustan. The 6 wise men of Hindustan, to learning much inclined, they went to see the elephant, though all of them were blind, and they all described the deity, which is the elephant. And then in the end, they're debating about who's right about the deity. They're all blind. None of them have actually seen the elephant, but they're all describing it. They're partly in the right, but they're all in the wrong. And my understanding of God and what that meant got so beyond. There was no more pronouns describing it. It was beyond. It didn't have grips on me that I felt guilt or shame from. It was just a broadened concept of deity that I had that, I don't even know if I would have called it deity. It was just bigger. It was more. It was something all encompassing. It was the universe. It was something else that would allow definitions to explain before I started to try and do a more naturalist approach. But what happens with you, Paul, as you're expanding your concept of God and taking a turn?
You see, those processes of expansion, what they did for me was turn me back into a seeker. Because I'd been a Christian for a long time, by the end of 33 years in church-based ministry, and I was full of conclusions. But what needed reanimating was Paul, the truth seeker, Paul, the detective, Paul, the investigator, and to realize there was no point in settling where I was because I clearly didn't have everything buttoned down, and I needed to do some more fundamental thinking about God. But after 33 years in church-based ministry, what happened was there's been a decline in most of the churches in Australia, and there's a pattern around the world, and the Anglican churches had declined so that I'd reached a level of experience and seniority for which there was really no tier of jobs. So I was one down from a bishop, but I wasn't going to become a bishop because the only kind of bishops that existed by that point were bishops who ran dioceses. And I'm not wired to run an organization. That was not going to be me. If they still had suffragan bishops who are pastoral bishops, yeah, I could have done that. If they still had specialist roles, diocesan advisors, in spirituality, church planting, whatever it might be, fresh expression, I could have done that. But I just reached a level of experience and seniority where there were no jobs for me. The only jobs with any money attached to them were the kind of jobs you'd give to people in their 20s. And so I began thinking, I think I've done everything I'm going to do. I think I've offered everything I have to offer. So I did one last pastorate. And it was another church doctor assignment. And it was a really challenging couple of years because it was a church that had an employment capacity for 2 people, but they had 8 people on the payroll. And they were in that position because they too had been declining. without really acknowledging what had been happening. And the congregation didn't know this. The congregation thought everything was fine. We've got 8 on the staff. We've got $1 million in the bank. We'll be able to move to our building with that money. And when I arrived, I realized, oh gosh, they've got 20 months before they're going to go bankrupt looking at these curves. And so there was a lot of very hard work I had to do to get the church to turn a corner so that it would have a future. And so reprofiling a payroll from 8 to 2, that's not a recipe for popularity, as you can imagine. And then we had to achieve a volunteer transition because the church was at an age where the original volunteers were now sort of retiring. New people were coming, but they needed bringing into positions. We needed to do an eldership transition so that there were people on the board who could do the fiduciary work, could do the business work, where they could look at the curves and say, oh my goodness, this means this. So it was very intense work, very tough. The longer I was in church-based ministry, the more business type work of this kind I was doing, which I found stretching. And at the end of that assignment, I thought, okay, I need a rest. That was hard work. So I'm going to take a pause. I'm going to take some months off. I'm going to get my equilibrium back, get my peace back, get my health back. I'm going to spend some months in nature, just going into the Australian bush, sunning, grounding, deep breathing. And I'm going to take this opportunity to do some study off my own bat, not for preaching sermons, but because I want to follow all these questions that have been on the back burner for so long. After Guy Consolmagno said the Bible was full of aliens, I wanted to go and test that. Are there other kinds of entity reported in the biblical stories, or was he exaggerating? Mm-hmm. And I wanted to be the one to go and do that work because I still had questions from when I was 11 reading Chariots of the Gods that I wanted to pursue. And so that's how I spent the next few months. And, you know, just like that Baptist pastor I mentioned before, I gave myself permission to go places I'd not been before, ask questions I'd not asked before, do translation work I hadn't done before. My first love was languages. When I was 12, another life-changing experience was passing a test called the 12 plus. And it got me into a better kind of school, a grammar school, where I had the opportunity to learn languages. And so I learned French, German, Italian, Portuguese, and ultimately at college, New Testament Greek. And so I went at these questions as translation issues. And when I found anomalies in the stories, or anomalies in the stories we tell from the biblical text, I tackled them as translation questions. And it was as I did that my world began changing very, very rapidly. And I went back to all those questions that I'd avoided as a young apologist, the Bible's dependence upon the Mesopotamian narratives. All right, so what is the connection between Noah and Ziusudra Utnapishtim Atrahasis? Why is there this funny word Elohim that appears to be a plural? And who are the Elohim that seem to get into wars with each other? Thousands of human beings slaughtered in the crossfire. These Elohim who get named, people like Dagon and Chemosh and Milcom and Asherah. Why is Yahweh so angry with the commemoration of those beings? Why does he acknowledge these other beings in his 10 commandments, both versions of them? And so when I found words like Elohim, Bene Elohim, Tzabah HaShemayim, Ruach, Kavod, that behave in very odd ways, I said, let's get to the root meanings of them. Because just like that word judgment, I think if you read a familiar translation, you will layer all the doctrines that have been accreted onto that word. What if we leave the words at their root meanings or leave them untranslated and then watch how they behave in the text? And so I took some months to do that. And when I went through that exercise, I realized that the stories changed. The Elohim stories changed. The Yahweh stories changed. But they didn't change in a random way. They changed in a way that reaffirmed the source narratives from out of ancient Sumer, Babylonia, Arcadia, and Assyria it was very easy for me to recognize, oh my goodness, this is the Hebrew version of the conflict between Enlil and Enki in Genesis 3. This really is a summary form of the Archdeacon story, and began to realize that some of the Hebrew Elohim stories are the Hebrew versions of Mesopotamian stories of sky people. And then I allowed to ask myself, what do we call sky people today? How would we describe this, these phenomena? I mean, the Keli Mapaso, for instance, and the Keli Mashito, and the Kavod and the Ruach are described in great detail, which to a 21st century mind are easy to interpret as technology. But 500 years ago, would Bible translators have looked for technological language, or would they have assumed we're looking at something spiritual here? And yes, of course, that's the answer. And then when you start reading the biblical accounts against the source narratives, they finesse each other. And you realize that there are aspects to this story that have never been picked up on, not only by preachers, but by Bible translators, because there's a kind of taboo around these questions. That set me on a journey around the world, listening to other ancient narratives, reading other ancient texts, to other world mythology, and realizing that a lot of the biblical stories, to understand them, you've got to read them in the context of Ugaritic Mesopotamian literature. And then I turned my attention to the New Testament and began realizing you can't really understand them reading them in a bubble either. That if you don't read them according to the sort of their contemporary neighbors, the world of Greco-Roman literature, you can't understand what they are. You're going to miss all the tropes that they're using. You're going to miss points the writers want you to get because you don't recognize, oh, look, here's an ascension story. Oh, here's another virgin birth story. But if you read it in a bubble, it becomes this unique story that only Christians can understand. As soon as you set the literature in the context of a global family of literature, you start reading it in a different way and asking very different questions.
I want to just say this, obviously, I'm skeptical about some stuff, but I'll tell you this, your idea about using the Mesopotamian background, and I really need to read your works. It'll be interesting to see, because I like that idea of trying to imagine mapping on, like, is this just a Hebrew rewrite? You know what I mean? And looking at it, because I do know they're using it. This is undeniable at this point. We know that they're using it, but it seems like you're narrating in a way that might help people follow along to see how they're using it. And I'll be interested to see what you say. As you know, I'm sure everyone watching Myth Vision knows the Greco-Roman world and the situational context specifically of the New Testament is everybody's like, yeah. And I think most of my audience would agree with everything you said pertaining to the Old Testament too. I just would like to see, because, we might as well get into the weeds here for a second. And I think this is important before we move to your exit of leaving the institution and being who you are, a free person to have, free thoughts and talk about what you find free and keep searching freely. Okay. That is, a lot of the scholars, as you know, identify Genesis 1-11. They usually put a little hard stop after 11 in terms of something else is happening. I don't draw the same line they do, but anyway, a lot of them do that. And I'm curious to get just an outline tease from you on where in the Old Testament do you find the narratives as rewrites that go beyond just the typical standard kosher Genesis 1-11. Like, they're all willing to go, yeah, that ziggurat for the tower, and we're all cool with that. But then you get to Abraham, then you get to Jacob, you get to Joseph, you start getting into Exodus. You like, where do you see also rewrites beyond those sections?
Yeah, the ziggurat is quite an exciting moment for me, because it's very enigmatic the way it's expressed in Genesis 11. What is the problem? Is it that, zoning laws have been breached, building codes have been breached. We built a building too tall. I mean, the text says that this structure was there to enable us to reach the heavens. Well, what does that mean when the heavens means skies, where there's no distinction between the two, and skies and space, there's no distinction. What does reach the heavens mean? As soon as you put that alongside the Enuma Elish, where we're told that from that location, 50 technicians dispatch 200 observers from there to their stations in the stars. Now we've got a finessed understanding of what reaching the heavens might mean. So I love these enigmatic moments. And Genesis 11 was where I used to draw the line as well. The stories of beginnings. And initially I was thinking, well, this is only logical. If Abraham was a real historic person, and if he emerged from Ur of the Chaldees, a Mesopotamian culture, then isn't it obvious he would bring his stories of beginnings with him? Isn't it obvious his stories would be Mesopotamian stories? That was how I started thinking about it, except that the Abraham story is a bit deeper than that and a bit more of a mystery. And now I don't draw a line at Genesis 11. I go into Genesis 12, and I believe that we're still in the stories of beginnings. And I believe that the Abraham and Sarah story is a story of human beings, beginning human origins, fused with a story of Hebrew origins. Now, the role it plays in the canon as we have it is this is the beginning, the story of the people of God. But Abraham and Sarah, the progenitors of many nations, have a curious parallel in the Vedas. Brahma and Saraswati are the progenitors of the many nations in Hinduism. Is that a coincidence? Because they're the same names. I mean, Hebrew with no vowels, let's look at his name, Brahma. And Saraswati in the Vedas, that means beautiful Sarah. So you've got Brahma and beautiful Sarah. In the Hebrew story, they are the progenitors of many nations. In the Vedas, the progenitors of the many nations. Might they be connected? Because in the Vedas, it's a human origins story. I happen to think there's another human origins story that's been layered into the Jacob and Esau story. Is that really a story of brothers? Does that really make sense to you, that there's a smooth-skinned kind of human being who's having to work out how to control the environment and get hegemony and dominate the environment when there's a more powerful, entirely hairy kind of human? And he does it by manipulating the hairy human with offerings of food. That's how we tame animals, for goodness sake. That's not a brother-to-brother relationship. That's got a whole other layer to it. And so we can read quite far into Genesis, and I think we're still reading, I won't say random, but a selection of human origin stories that have been layered in to this now overarching story of Hebrew origins. This is nothing strange. This is not a strange thing to say. If you read the Epic of Gilgamesh, for instance, which as we have it is about 4,000 years old, it's clear that within the Epic of Gilgamesh, there are even older stories that the writer has said, oh, I'm going to bring that in, I'm going to bring that in, I'll bring that in, and I'll fuse it into this overarching story of why King Gilgamesh was so wise and why Uruk was the best city ever. So I'm going to include the Utnapishtim story, because everyone knows that. I'm going to include Enkidu and Shamhat. Everyone knows that story. I'm going to include this hero's journey and these battles as well. So earlier stories come into the epic, and I think earlier stories are coming into the epic far further into the Bible than Genesis 11.
Right.
And so I think we have to give ourselves permission to think about what was this before. And this is what I always do. What was this text before it was in this shape? And sometimes it's fairly clear. And sometimes you've got to do a bit of detective work, but you don't have to do too much detective work before you realize there is this plurality of beings, the Elohim, the Bene Elohim. You've got this mysterious arrival of beings as the Tzavah HaShemayim, the sky fleet. And then you've got them gathering together in council, Ba'adat El. You've got this post-invasion moment where this being, El Elyon, is parceling out the lands among the Elohim. And the Elohim are each getting a portion of land, the minerals in the land, the people on the land. Yahweh only gets a people group. And so he's obviously a junior member of the Elohim. And so his first action in the story of the Bible is to go and retrieve his people group from the land of another Elohim, from Achech of Egypt. El Elyon has created this artificial scarcity that means Yahweh, of course, he's jealous of the other Elohim because he's now got to battle to get some land of his own. Now, none of that story makes sense if you think Yahweh is Almighty God. And when you get into how can Almighty be God, be a junior member of this council, and who's El Elyon then? You know, these are pretty obvious questions. And where was I going to go from there? Yes, if you think Yahweh is God, the maths doesn't math.
Yeah.
That was the beginning of my process.
Oh my God, this is so fun.
And Almighty God isn't in the Bible. That's an invention. It's an invented translation for El Shaddai.
Right.
And I've become persuaded that El Shaddai, the root meanings of those words are the powerful one, the destroyer. So when the El Shaddai shows up to Abraham and says, I'm the powerful one, the destroyer, walk in front of me and don't put a foot wrong. Within 2 chapters, he has destroyed 2 cities, just to make the point. El Shaddai doesn't mean the Almighty, which is how it gets translated by our noble Bible translators. But if you get a good Bible with good footnotes, it will tell you the Almighty is an invented translation. And of course, the Almighty gets us into all kinds of logical problems if we start thinking of God in that way.
It's interesting you said that the Balaam inscription, and I can't recall it off the top of my head, but in the Balaam inscription, which is older than our Bible, it indicates that the Shaddai gods are actually coming after El. They're trying to usurp El. So there's this war going on, it sounds like. And I can't remember if it's Francesca Stavrokopoulou, it might be her and someone else that's actually saying the Shaddai gods, or they're not even called Shaddai gods, they're this Shaddai beings that are actually trying to thwart or fight against El in the context. And it's been a while since I brushed up on it. But one thing I want to say that I think is interesting before I want to get back to your story, because we're derailing into the fun stuff that we like to do, but I really want to get your story on record. And that is, I know, I love this stuff though, but you bring up an interesting point. When God is parsing out, or El is parsing out the territories, you would think, you'd be like, oh, he gave him Israel. You know, he gave him this land called Israel. It's already occupied and someone else clearly has it. That's an odd statement, Deuteronomy 32, to say, hey, yeah, I'm giving you this land, but it's full of people and clearly run by someone else. You've got to kick this guy out and his people from this region that he's. That's such an odd question we've never asked ourselves. Was like, hold on, God gave this, like, if we take El to just be God, like the Father, the chief one on the mount, the high dad of the sky, so to speak, and he's saying, hey, you're getting, okay, this is your portion of land. It's not vacant, okay, and it's like kind of like, how do we never really think about this question? Is like, wouldn't you have thought, hey, there's this plot of land, nobody's on there, go ahead and, you know, take your people over there and start generating and populating and whatnot? No, like, you have to go there now and you have to annihilate the people who are indigenous to this land according to the mythos that we're reading. And I'm thinking to myself, that's an interesting question, Paul, that you actually bring up that I never really thought about.
Yeah. And it's a story. I mean, it's a story of invasion and colonization that repeats in the narratives of other cultures. So Plato makes reference to this in his writings. It's there in the Norse stories as well, of course.
Interesting. Okay. Back on track. What happened and how did you get excommunicated? No, I'm kidding. So what happened, Paul? What happened to make you say, was this the experience? Because you had some freedom here to really
Yeah.
dig and said, holy
Yeah.
smokes, I don't think I
Holy
can go back
mackerel.
to playing the games anymore. I can't.
Yeah.
What happened?
Yeah, well, that is exactly what happened. So I started following my curiosity, doing the translation work, realizing there was this whole other layer of story there, that many of the stories I'd taken as God's stories weren't God's stories. It was a huge relief, because suddenly I realized God wasn't this murderous, unforgiving, xenophobic figure at all. What I was reading about were violent colonizations, violent invasion by these mysterious Elohim. And to associate that with God is a total mistake, just as Origen said way back in the beginning. So for me, there was a sense of personal relief of, yeah, that never did make sense to me. This makes more sense. And by the time I'm thinking that, I'm thinking, now what church is going to welcome this this line of preaching? But by that point, I mean, I had been in church-based ministry for 33 years, and I was recognizing I'd reached a level of experience, age, seniority, were really not the kind of jobs I was interested in. And there was something about that number as well, 33. I thought that's a good number. That's like a lifetime. I don't feel beholden to continue my ministry in the congregational setting. And I've always been a writer. My first book was published when I was 26. And I thought, I really want to share the journey I'm on, because I think it's really important. I began to realize that if you have a violent image of God, it begets violence in our theology and in our social behavior. If you have a violent, conquering God who invades other people's land and obliterates the indigenous people, you will do the same in his name, which we have time and time again. So from the moment that Christianity became the department of religion for the Roman Empire, from that time to this, we've used the violent God as a theological gloss to put over all our imperial expansions. So getting God wrong, has some real consequences. I had a really heart-rending letter from a parent just recently whose teenage child had suicided because of the theology that he was being taught in his church.
Oh.
And he felt that he was a sinner, that he was always sinning, that he couldn't see any way out of that, and that the longer he lived, the more offensive he would be to God. The best way of minimizing the offense he would cause God would be to minimize his life. And it was the logical conclusion of the theology being fed him. If you've got a hateful, violent, brutal, unforgiving God, it has real world consequences, whether at the individual level or whether at the level of enslaving other people or invading other people's countries. So I felt this is really important. And the freedom I was feeling as my vision of God expanded, I thought I have to share this journey. So rather than looking for more ministry positions, I'm going to write my book. I'm going to publish my book. I'm going to promote my book. I'm going to give 100% to this book, Escaping from Eden, because I think it's an important moment. And I also felt it was an important moment in terms of theology that is ready to find life in the cosmos, because I recognized that other than in the Roman Catholic Church following that colloquium, the churches are not ready for that. The churches are so unready for that. I mean, I get messages from people who say, oh, the universe isn't empty. Our planet has human beings on it. All the other planets have demons on them. And they've come to that conclusion because they're in this form of faith where the whole of reality has to fit within a very small canon of categories. If something is real, then it's either God, the devil, angels, demons, human, animal, vegetable, mineral, or it doesn't exist.
Right.
And so there's a whole group of people who've become persuaded we've got company. Well, what is must be demons.
Yeah.
And so there is that problem. The churches are not ready. And so I thought, I have to write my book. And that was the decision I took. It wasn't really a decision about a career or a career change or coming out of ministry. My next book, I thought, has to be about this. I've shared other aspects of the journey, but this is a really important one. And of course, Escaping from Eden evolved into the Eden series, evolved into the Fifth Kind and the Paul Wallis channel, Ancient Knowledge Academy, and everything has rolled on from there. Not because it was all pre-planned, but that's just how things unfolded.
You're on a journey, and you're continuing to be on a journey. And I think people can tell when someone is just excited, enthusiastic, and isn't bound by what you are allowed to think about or try to learn about. Obviously, you're doing things. I think you're a great human being. You and I've had some really deep private conversations as well. I want to just say this for my audience in case they're watching. When all the stuff that went down in the past, I don't want to bring up old wounds for our friends here, but with the whole Wes Huff thing, I'll just say, I had some decisions to make for myself as a human being with that. And do you feel comfortable talking about that with me?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Because I'm totally comfortable with it. And me and Billy Carson don't agree on tons of stuff. But I mean, who do I agree with everything on? I mean, the greatest person in my life, my better half, we can't agree on what to eat for lunch. Okay. So and that's okay. But when that attack happened, and it wasn't just the debate, it was the aftermath that happened that ultimately became the ugly nature of it. And the way that people treated Billy, I felt in my heart like, whoa, 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 whoa. The humanity in me came out. I'm like, hold on, man. Like, I get it if he's mistaken. You can gotchas, you can make debates, you can do all that kind of stuff. Once I heard about the treatment of him from Christians, calling him the N-word, doing all the things they were doing, and you and I had a deep conversation. You said, it reminded you of Michael, what's his name? George Michael. And, he had his audience at the end of the day, whether or not, he was afraid to come out and be who he really is. And on Oprah, he finally admitted it. He said, well, I kind of figured out, I was scared at first, but at the end of the day, it was like, do I want that as my audience or not? And when you told, that was some wisdom that you spit at me, because I was like, at the end of the day, I'm a human. And I think if history goes down that I'm defending someone over an ethical issue, even if I don't necessarily align on everything,
exactly,
that's more important to me than the Heracles Wes Huff, the hero of the day of the Christian dogma, who is out here trying to fight against the evil, wicked Paul Wallis, the Derek Lamberts, you know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah, I do. I really despise this idea of guilty by association. And I do have people contacting me saying, Paul, you shouldn't talk to Billy Carson. And in the days leading up to this conversation, I've had people saying, Paul, you shouldn't talk to Derek Lambert.
Mm-hmm.
And I do my best to respond intelligently to these kind of discussions. Why shouldn't I? I can talk to anybody.
Yeah.
I don't have to agree 100% with a person to have a conversation. I don't agree 100% with Billy Carson.
Yeah.
Some of our conclusions overlap. There is definitely an overlap of some conclusions, but I came to Billy's defense because I felt what was done to him was so unjust. And it wasn't that he was necessarily on top of all his sources in that conversation. He was genuinely very ill. I think he was very ill-advised to do that interview, that recording at all. But then I think the way it was chaired was very, very frustrating for me, because I could see the points that Billy was wanting to make in that conversation. And when he raised the point about the Bible's dependence on Mesopotamian literature, it was just completely dismissed as nonsense and rubbish by Wes, who, I mean, that's not his field. He doesn't know about it. It's not his area.
Yep.
But the way the conversation was discussed, look, Billy's been debunked. And then when Billy wants to talk about, well, in the beginning, Christianity was a whole kaleidoscope of ideas and theologies and documents, experiences, and they included literature that talked about Jesus in a relationship, that hinted at Jesus having a wife. This is all a perfectly fair conversation if you're interested to know what the early kaleidoscope of beliefs is. But if you're an apologist, no thank you, or find some way to rubbish that. And I felt, well, I'll say it, I think there's a little bit of dishonesty in how that was all pushed to one side, trying to trip Billy up so he couldn't make any of his points. And I think if it had been better chaired, there could have been really interesting conversations between the two, but it wasn't. And Billy knew this had been very bad for him, and he asked for it not to be shown. Now, if I have a guest on my channel and we have a conversation and my guest says, "Oh, Paul, I really don't think I did myself justice. Can you not show that?" Why on earth would I show it? Why would I do that? Even if I disagreed wholeheartedly with the person, why would I do that to a person? And the fact that that is what happened next, and then it was taken down, and then it was reposted by Wes, and then it became this viral thing. I thought, this is disgusting. And this kind of behavior from people who call themselves Christians really needs calling out. And I know that led you to do a number of shows on your channel. It led me to do some recordings with Billy to show actually there is something serious you can look at here on these topics, because I just felt that what had gone down was unfair. And it's helpful for people to know that in the beginning, Christianity was this kaleidoscope. It's helpful for people to know that biblical stories are dependent on earlier sources. So I wanted to get that information out afresh. And as I say, you were saying exactly the same thing. It was really a human issue, an issue of humanity and justice that sort of drew me into that conversation.
Yeah, clearly, I mean, just being frank from my side, there was a lot of errors that were made, in my opinion, on Billy's side in that discussion. And at the same time, while there were errors, and everybody makes them, there were many Wes made that people just...
Oh, yeah. No, and it's like totally ignored.
So
totally
both sides were not performing the best, but because Wes rhetorically went the way that he did, and then of course continued to publish it, and then I think it was the drama that made it more significant than the debate itself, because when you listen to the debate, it was not like, oh my gosh, this was a heated, wild exchange. It became that due to the, hey, can you not show this? And then there's screenshots and legalities and all this, and then they made a big thing and turned it into something. But anyway, I just wanted
to having said that, there was a little bit of me that could identify with Wes, because I remember at theological college, I was that I was that apologist, I was that propagandist, and Wes clearly wanted to win the arguments, and I sort of recognized that in myself from an earlier incarnation of myself, and I thought, yeah, I know what you're doing.
Well, there's nothing wrong with that. Okay.
Well, yeah, no. There is if it's dishonest.
Yeah,
there is if you're shutting someone down who's going to make a valid point, or if someone raises something you can't answer. There's no shame if you're a real apologist or evangelist in saying, I haven't studied that, or I don't know that. I'll need to look that up.
All I'm saying is there's nothing wrong with catching people making errors in a debate or whatever. What really gets me is that I knew more of the background behind this even. See, the reason why this even involved me, because I wouldn't have been involved had I not had probably my friend Neil from Gnostic Informant get attacked by Wes. Okay, so what happened was this. Billy wasn't even on the radar for me. I didn't even know who. I mean, I might have seen a video in passing and was like, but just kept skipping and never really paid attention to who he was. When Wes Huff did a video against my friend Neil, Gnostic Informant, me and Neil are friends. We live near each other. We connect. We learn from one another, all sorts of stuff. He did this video, and we know because Wes had been in contact with Danny Jones. You know who Danny Jones is?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Okay.
When it's safe for me to come to America, I'll be on his show.
Okay, cool. So he lives near me, like hour and a half. Danny Jones does. Neil lives 15 minutes down the road. Well, Neil went on Danny Jones and he talked about the scandalous missing ending of Mark and ultimately why this was problematic for the early church to the point where they had to craft and invent a whole 9 or 11 verses. I can't remember.
It's 16 verses, I think, is it?
I thought it was like verses 9 to 20. So it's like 11 verses, I think.
Oh, yes. Yeah, for sure.
Because it stops at 16:8. Well, he was bringing this up, and Wes did this a hit piece trying to discredit Neil because he went on a very popular platform. Wes, if you go back and look through the records around that time, he was already trying to hit Joe Rogan. He was trying to already target big to grow, right? So I think he did this hit on Neil to get attention. Of course, aren't we all in a sense trying to grow? Sure. But I think that he had it, like, it's almost like by hook or crook. I need to get attention and become famous. I need to get up there. I need the clout to grow and to become famous and do this, because he was already trying to hit people who were on big channels to try and grow a name for himself, because he only had like 30,000 subs at the time. So he did this hit piece on Neil, right? He made so many errors in this hit piece. We completely came at him. I'm sure you saw that episode when we came at him, showing that he even showed the Alexandrinus, where the long ending of Mark is there and there's the space. He didn't even realize he was identifying, like, he's the textual scholar critic, right? He didn't even realize he made this boo-boo, right? Well, me and Neil caught him with his pants down. His whole following is like in my comment section defending him at all costs. A week later, I had one of Wes's friends, because Wes wouldn't come on, and we've invited him on like over and over and over. Let's do this.
Yeah.
And
he's fully booked till the end of 2029.
He's fully booked till 2059. I mean, for all I know, he's obviously, unless you have a lot of money or you have a big channel. But he ultimately got completely, I mean, like, looked bad, really bad. He removed the video from the internet. No apologies to Neil for misrepresenting Neil, no nothing. And then we call him out for a debate. Right? It's like, you want to debate? Let's do it. Neil's like, I will debate you anytime, any place, right now. Where what's up? He then puts out 2 days later a video, generic. Many people have requested to debate with me. My time is extremely like, bro, he saw the writing on the wall that we were coming for him. And then he did this thing with Billy Carson. And I think that's what launched him to the moon. So in a sense, I saw what he did to Neil, misrepresenting and not identifying it. I had already been influenced by Assyriologists who've identified Genesis is absolutely dependent upon earlier Mesopotamian stories for thousands of years prior to Genesis. And then I listened to the debate and I go, okay, yeah, I disagree with Billy on this. I mean, I was very just blunt. Don't agree with Billy. Don't agree. And didn't even know Billy, never knew who the guy was. Wes, totally wrong. He's pulling apologetics. He's correct about these facts, about a certain things that he's identifying about text that Billy should have been better prepared for, or been, more mentally there after his illness. And I just went through and fairly was critical of both, and then brought the highlights that I thought were good in a live stream for both, and then walked away. Didn't have a personal impression of Wes or Billy in any way. When the aftermath came out and I saw that this was a human being who was really going through some shit, and the internet, excuse my French, but I have to be real with you. The internet does not care. They carry no empathy. They just think, oh, you don't believe with what I believe. You're a grifter. You're the worst possible human being. You deserve everything that's coming your way, and not actually getting to know a human behind the screen. That's when I broke. And I said, okay, enough. I'm going to reach out and see if I can't communicate with this man as a human, find out how Billy's doing. And at the time, he wasn't doing too well. And that was more important to me than being right or having correct thinking or any of that. You know what I mean?
I think to broaden it out a bit, I personally don't think debates are helpful, because debates are never about the speakers trying to understand each other's point of view. A debate exists so you can defeat your opponent's point of view. And there's always that temptation, to defeat them by means fair or foul, trip them up if you can trip them up, because you want the vote at the end of the debate. I'm very open to discussions, though, and I'm always enriched by having conversations with people who may have a very different view to mine. And as I said earlier, I don't find that threatening at all. I think that's really, really healthy. Yeah. And I think it's good for readers. It's good for audience to see people who have different views, comparing their ideas, disagreeing with one another, doing it courteously. I think those are the skills we really need to foster in our society right now. We're at a time, especially in America, where people are very polarized in their thinking, whether we're in the world of theology or politics. And we need to really nurture that aspect of ourselves and our society where we can sit down with all kinds of people and compare all kinds of ideas and do it respectfully and be willing to hear something you've not heard before, to hear another view you might not have credited before, maybe to go back and give a second hearing to someone that you've dismissed before. So debates, I think, are not that useful. Even the best, Oxford-style debates. I think conversation, round table conversation is where it's at for me.
Well, forgive me in advance. I might start engaging in debates. People like them, and also, I'm much more of a dialogue guy like you, but I might have to enter the fray to bring the knowledge I have brought and have to do something that is a bit out of my
look, I've got to say, I do enjoy it when you do that, because you do it very well and it has a great energy to it. So I guess horses for courses.
Yeah. And again, we have a common cause of trying to help people. Paul, I don't want to cut you off. There's so much good stuff here. I got some super chats, but I want to allow you to have maybe a ribbon we could put on this for now, because I think we have much more we can get into in the future.
Okay.
Do you have any way to round out the story so that we can get to Q&A? I don't want to leave anybody hanging, but I'm sorry to derail this.
Yes. So I get a lot of pushback from people who think that I'm out to debunk Christianity or to debunk the Bible. And very often I'll say, well, actually, I've been a follower of Jesus for 44 years now. I have a belief in God, and I seek to follow the teachings of Jesus. And I've discovered that is not enough to make a person a Christian in the opinions of many. But I always feel I need to define what I mean if I use the word God, because that's another one of those words that has layers of meaning piled on top of it. And if I use the word God with some people, they'll get the heebie-jeebies and all these old doctrines of sin versus obedience and fallen humanity and heaven and hell click into place, and they don't want to talk about it. And I've found very helpful the definition of God that the Apostle Paul gives in Acts 17 when he's speaking to a non-Christian, non-Jewish audience. That's how it plays out in the story. And he uses the Greek word for God, of course, theos. And he says, by theos, I mean the source. And I'm trying to use language that isn't too loaded. I'm trying to use a rootsier interpretation. And this comes in 2 or 3 sections in his speech. He says, by theos, I mean the source of the cosmos and everything in it, that in which we all live and move and have our being, of which we are all offspring. And I find that a really helpful way of thinking about God, because it's almost like a logical statement. If we're all offspring, if we're all emanations of the source, then it means my intelligence is a participation in a property of the universe, something that's out there. My consciousness is a participation in something that's from the source. It's really just like a statement of logic, and there's no separation in it. Religion of a negative kind, I think, often trades in separation anxiety. You're separated from God, and listen to the priests because they'll tell you how to claw your way back into his presence. Whereas this image of we're all emanations of God, we live and move and have our being in God. God is the source of the cosmos and everything in it. I think that's a much more expansive vision. When I was at theological college, I read about people who would approach the New Testament in a way that was referred to as Sachkritik, where you could have a higher view of one saying than another. And I thought, oh, that's deplorable. Except that's I now do that. When I read the Bible, I think, oh, this is a high moment. This quote here, this is really special. I'm really going to invest some time into that. And that quote is one of those moments for me. It's a much more cosmic image of God, and it helps me to move away from, humanity writ large, Santa Claus in the sky. And it leads me to look for evidences that God is that expansive, that God is not this individual puppet master kind of thing that I thought he was in my neat and tidy Orthodox evangelical days. And it's such an expansive way of speaking that, again, it flicks the switch and turns a person into a seeker. What does this look like? What does this mean? How do we experience this? And this is all of us. This isn't a tribal explanation of God. We all live and move and have our being in this reality. So I find that inclusive, and it enables me to have a genuine respect for everyone I talk to. In the past, my Orthodox days, really there was nothing I could learn from a non-believer. Now I don't take that view at all.
You and me have some great talks, don't we? I learn from you. You learn from me. It's always
absolutely.
Yeah. No, I do pick up that energy from you, and I'm sure you would have been just as kind when you were a believer, but I know that there were certain walls we had and certain things that we wouldn't, be able to go down. So if you're ready, let's dive into some super chats.
Okay.
Awesome. Okay, Solera Knight, thank you so much for being a member and super chatting. You were the first in line, and I'm going to work down chronologically or sequentially. Let us, goddesses, make man, general man, Genesis 1:26 and Genesis 5:3, Adam and Eve, make man own image. Every man-woman unit becomes one flesh, thus becomes an Elohim, Genesis 2:24. What are your thoughts about that? I don't even know what to make of this.
So this is one of those anomalous verses, of course, where you've got Elohim, this plural form word, saying, let us make the humans to look like one of us. And then there's an echo of that in Genesis 3. Now the humans have become like one of us. And the language is really interesting because it's very concrete. Look like, that same word is used when I think Seth is born, and he's described as the spitting image of his dad. So it's a very concrete physical resemblance story. And so in this verse, I see an echo of the earlier stories of the creation of human beings, such as we find in the Enuma Elish and in the Atrahasis. And there's a hint of a human creation story in the Epic of Gilgamesh as well. So I think the earlier version of the story is just very concrete, that we look like our makers. We look like those who worked with our ancestors, tweaked them a little bit to get them as good looking as we are.
Yeah, I the whole later on spiritualization interpretation to me, I'm with
no, yeah, doesn't wash.
I'm with you. Bakken, thank you so much for the super chat and being a member, and thank you for your patience. I'm sure you've been waiting. Hey, get my super chat. Bakken sent several super chats. I was shrugged, he says, from the church after I discovered cannabis in the Old Testament in Exodus 30:23. In the holy oil and incense, a truth that began my deconstruction.
Oh, that's really intriguing. So our friend is talking about cannabosum oil, which is one of a cocktail of oils in which the layered tents were drenched that comprised the Holy of Holies. And so the speculation is that was done, should we say, for aromatherapeutic reasons, that it was there to affect the state of mind and the mood and the state of consciousness of the priests in that place. And that they were doing this because they were wanting to broker contact experiences with their Elohim. And I think that's very interesting because it would correlate with other cultic practices in other places.
Like
it's
shamanistic,
not,
like a shaman.
yeah, exactly. And it's not something well, not just things we think of as shamanistic, but very mainstream cultic practices. Like if you look at the Jaguar dynasty in Mesoamerica, they had protocols to create an altered state of consciousness for the priest kings and the priest queens so that they could have a contact experience with the feathered serpents who no longer lived with them. So this pattern of our ancestors had contact with this kind of being, they're not here anymore. Now we go through these ceremonies to try and get contact. You're absolutely right that shamans around the world do that, but priest kings did it as well. And yes, it's possible that we're looking at something like that in the Hebrew tradition as well. Now, this is not something I go to the stake over,
Right.
But I find the connections quite compelling. So I do understand where our question is coming from.
If only next Sunday the pastor would say, we're going to talk about cannabis. And thank you so much. Nicole's so rich. Thank you for the super chat and being a member of the channel. Just a comment about Jesus, not talking about hell. Matthew 8:12, 22:13, and 25:30 describes darkness, weeping, and gnashing of teeth for people who are not chosen. Is this not describing a hell? Paul, you mind if I make a quick jab here just to say?
Yeah, you feel free.
Okay, so I personally take the stance that the New Testament's not univocal, and you probably would agree with me that it's not one message. I think there are different ideas that are floating around in the New Testament that have different descriptions of what they're trying to say about punishment that may be there. But then again, I just want to make that comment because mainly this is you. I'm guesting you here, and I want you to be able to give your personal take because I think you've said you haven't found it convincing. But if I understand you correctly, you're talking about the whole Apocalypse of Peter, Dante's Inferno kind of interpretation, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I mean, hell as a place of eternal conscious torment goes way beyond what the Gospels and the New Testament have to offer. And it's a good question, but just reading the words of that question, I would take the word hell off the end of it, because that's the word that's got all these doctrines layered into it. How about we just stick with darkness, weeping, and gnashing of teeth and say that's what the text says? So you can take that approach, stick to the words. What does it say? Of course, the word hell doesn't appear anywhere. We have the word Gehenna, which is generally translated as hell, but Gehenna was the rubbish tip beyond the walls of Jerusalem. Do you believe Jesus was warning people that they might end up in the rubbish tip outside of Jerusalem? No. So immediately we're now thinking religious language. We're thinking about metaphor. What does darkness, weeping, and gnashing of teeth mean? What is that saying? It's a figure for something bigger. So what is the bigger thing? So I think we've got to think more carefully about the actual words, the actual verse. When I went to theological college, I spent a long time on this question, and I mapped all the texts that speak to the question of, well, the theological frame was the fate of the wicked. And I realized that there's this gap between the Gehenna teachings, a reference to Sheol, and the church's developed teaching of eternal conscious torment. I took my question to a very well-known preacher who had a major preaching platform. He's known internationally. And he used to preach hell as eternal conscious torment. And I wrote to him and I said, here are all the scriptures that speak to this. Tell me how you get to your doctrine from these, because I can see many texts that you could read a few ways. A lot of texts that seem to talk about undoing, ruination, destruction. I can only find two where I think the plain reading would support what you're saying. Mm-hmm. One is in Judith and one is in Revelation.
Right.
First of all, do you
smoke day and night?
Yeah,
never,
exactly. And the worm that never dies. So do you really build your doctrine on this text from the Apocrypha? And I was goading him a bit because he was a sort of reformed evangelical tight on the canon person. And this obviously metaphorical text that doesn't even include human beings in it from Revelation. Is that where you get this from? And initially he replied, he says, listen to some tapes I've got on this topic. It'll set you straight. And I listened to them, and of course they didn't. Every time, the word hell came up in the English translation, click, 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 all his doctrine clicked into place. So I got back to him and I said, no, can you just look at those texts I sent you? Tell me how you get to your conclusions from those texts. And he said very honestly, I'm going to have to think about this. He said, my friend is doing a PhD on this. Give me a few weeks, I'll get back to you. Well, I gave him 20 years. And 20 years later, I asked where he'd reached in his thinking. And what he said amazed me. This world famous reformed evangelical preacher who had written a book on the topic and was always preaching on it. I said, I don't know if you remember, we had an earlier correspondence about the biblical support for the doctrine of hell. And he said, I have come to the conclusion, and he did talk a little bit like this, I have come to the conclusion that if you just read the Gospels and New Testament at face value, you will never reach the doctrine of eternal conscious torment. You will not find it in the Bible unless you hold the belief a priori, which I do, always have, and nothing will persuade me otherwise.
20 years. 20
What? You are supposed to be a reformed theologian, and you're saying you have to believe this before you read the text because it's not in the text? Listen to yourself. I didn't say that, but all that went through my head. And the scandal of it is he was still preaching it all that time, having reached the point where he knew he couldn't defend it, where it wasn't in the text, even for him who believed in the doctrine. And yet he would put that on people, absolutely disgusted by that, really, really disgusted because of how it affects people at an individual level, how it affects families and family dynamics. It's an absolute disgrace. And he's looked to as a leader by many evangelical preachers around the world. And so I give a whole chapter to that in my book, The Eden Conspiracy, because I want anyone who reads The Eden Conspiracy to know that this is rubbish. It doesn't merit their time and attention. It's even if they want to be a tight biblical fundamentalist Christian, you don't have to believe that because it really isn't there.
I will say one comment, and then we've got too many super chats. I don't want to spend too much time. We'll be here all night, all day for you in Australia. And that is, I remember talking to Robert Price a while back about this, and he's a theologian. He's got 2 PhDs in theology. This guy's like a wizard. And he met a universalist preacher, well-known, famous universalist preacher. And he said, do you ever notice carefully, when you look really careful at the Matthew passage where it talks about the fire that is prepared, he said, for the devil and his angels? He said, if you notice, it's not prepared for humans. It's prepared for the devil and his angels. And I was like, interesting. So anyway, there's a lot of interesting things you're highlighting. This, like, when you look carefully at it, you kind of go, what's going on there? Interpretations. Anyway. All right, moving to the next. Bakken, thank you again for the super chat. Religion is an outflow of our endogenous cannabinoid system. The filling is an anandamide, the bliss chemical which is produced in religious ecstatic state.
Oh, I love that idea. And yes, there are blissful states and there are ecstatic states that people experience within the world of religion. As I say, these kind of experiences actually bust our boundaries because you'll find all kinds of people, mystics, secular people, people of faith who have these kinds of experience. That's lovely. What worries me about religion when it becomes institutional is this aspect of thought control, social control, and again, something that fires me up and motivates me to write the Books of the Eden series is that when religion has a doctrinal basis that it wants to pull people into, it involves, well, just say it as it is, it involves shutting down the intelligence, curiosity, and conscience of our children. And I think that's a scandal too. Children have natural intelligence, natural curiosity, natural conscience. They can read a story in the Bible and say, that doesn't make sense. A child can say, why is my God of love, I don't know if I can say this word on YouTube, but, wiping out humanity because he's changed his mind? This is a war crime. This is the most wicked thing imaginable. Why are we saying that was good? And that was a child will ask the question, and then an adult will gaslight them. And I think that's appalling, because the child will work out that they have to act dumb. They have to ignore their own thoughts, ignore their own feelings, if they are going to be allowed to fit into this community of faith. And this community of faith might include their entire family. I'm contacted by people on a regular basis who've been thrown out of Bible study groups, churches, and Sunday schools as children for asking a question that the leader couldn't answer. This isn't 30 years ago. This is right now, because often our small groups, our Bible study groups, our Sunday schools are staffed by people who believe their job is to get everyone into this tight doctrinal world. And if they haven't got all the children to say they believe these things, they failed. They feel that's their job as, lieutenants of this community that's based on particular conclusions. This is so destructive. This is absolute rubbish. I find children super intelligent. I find having children has been wonderful for me, because through all my intellectual journey, I've followed the advice of Archbishop Ramsay, who was a great Church of England archbishop, who said, if you can't explain something to a child in the way the child understands, perhaps you haven't understood it. And I've really taken that to heart, because I have had my kids with me through all my deconstruction journey, all the journey that's led to the Fifth Kind, the Eden series. And they're always asking me, what are you working on today, Daddy? And I find if I can't tell them in a way they can understand, then I need to think a bit more about it. But I find my kids super intelligent. I'm sure we all say that about our own kids. And I've enjoyed conversations I have with them about ideas of faith. And I love it that they come home from school every so often and they'll say, we were talking about some Bible story at school today, and the teacher said this. Well, I wasn't sure about it. And I remember one conversation like this that I had with my daughter when she was 11. And it was I think it was the moment when God decided to kill 70,000 infantry because King David had offended him by looking like he might be reviewing orders before putting them into practice. This was his punishment, if you remember. And so the teacher had said that God had killed all these people. And my daughter Evie said to me, I don't think that sounds right at all. Why would God kill people who had nothing to do with something like that? And I said, well, I agree with your question, Evie. It doesn't seem to make sense. Did you say something? She said, yes, I put my hand up and I asked the teacher to explain how this could possibly be the case if God is a God of love. And I said, and what did the teacher say? And she said, well, he gave an answer, but I wasn't sure he really believed what he was saying.
Back to mom and dad, huh?
Yeah. So this is great. This is great because she's got that sensitivity. I know when I'm being given a non-answer, that was not a good answer. I don't think he was even convinced. It was that moment of, I think he's given me some propaganda that even he doesn't hold to. And so I was able to say, I love how you're thinking. I think along the same lines as you, Evie. I don't think that really is a God story. And I think if we can work with the curiosity and intelligence of our kids, we'll have conversations like that. And I wish that was more the nature of conversations in Bible studies and Sunday schools around the world.
Well said. Thank you. Thank you so much, Bakken. Bakken again says the Old Testament, and thank you again, the Old Testament rewrites the Israelites' history of Asherah and her incense, cannabis. I think they're trying to say it's related to this idea,
Yep.
and her nature cycle with Yahweh in his original nature cycle like Baal.
Yeah. Okay. So the rewriting of the history that includes beings like Asherah is really interesting, because we are told something about this process within the narratives of the Bible itself. So the monotheization of Judaism, or the production of Judaism as we know it as a monotheistic religion, we can see the beginnings of that story in the Bible. And it really begins in earnest when Hezekiah becomes king. And he is a Yahwist. But remember, Yahweh is one of the many Elohim. And he has a high priest, Hilkiah. And I don't know whose idea it was, whether it was his high priest, who was a Yahwist high priest, or whether it was Hezekiah's. But the idea comes along, sire, don't you think it would be good if all your people worshipped your God instead of all having their own? Wouldn't it be good if your people were involved in the cultic practice of the Yahwist priesthood, not all these other priesthoods which were out there, Jewish priesthoods established by previous kings, other temples scattered throughout Judea? Hezekiah thinks, yes, you're absolutely right. We should all be Yahwists. And so he sends his army in to deface all the depictions of the Tzavah Hashemayim. Every image that shows these other Elohim, get rid of them. The other priesthoods, bit by bit, get rid of them. We don't want any other ministry of truth. Get rid of the other temples, break the horns off the altars, let all the tithes come to the Yahwist temple, administered by the high priestly family of the Yahwist cult. So you've now got a neat, tidy, orderly, theocratic society. One God, and he Yahweh, one king, one high priest, one temple. And so they begin going through a ritual reform. And I mean, that includes a violent reform in Ezekiel, if you remember. If a family doesn't come out into the public square and grieve over the existence of these carvings, well, they can be killed using this equipment that I mentioned earlier, the Keli Mapaso, the Keli Mashito. Awful. I mean, it's hard for us to imagine until, I mean, I might mention North Korea, and if you don't show open grief at the sickness or death of the great leader in the public square, you're going to be in trouble. It's that kind of scenario in Ezekiel, this great cleanup that's happening. Jeremiah himself acknowledges that this cleanup is needed, and that the mainstream view of the people of Israel seems to involve a wide canon of memory associated with these other Elohim, Asherah in particular, where he says, on every high hill and under every green tree, there's an installation to Asherah. We can't have that. That's a disgrace. And in one moment, this is a good moment when you're reading Jeremiah to separate the narrator's information from the narrator's opinion, because the narrator has just told you what was the cultic practice and what were the beliefs of the people of Israel in the 8th to 7th century BCE, and it was a canon of paleo contact, to use my language, or academics will say it was a polytheistic view that they had. It was a commemoration of these other beings who they regarded as great heroes. Asherah was regarded as a great hero. This is the bringer of the fertility to the people, to the land, the beginning of agriculture, the beginning of civilization. Of course, we love Asherah. Can't have that if you're going to be a Yahwist monotheist. And so Asherah is talked about in a way as if she's only an object, as if she's only some kind of stick or some kind of pole. And the narrative begins to shift with the layering of value language on top of the actual reportage. So that's the beginning of the process. We're paring it down. We're not going to bow down to other Elohim. We're not even going to depict them. So that's in the 10 Commandments. There has to be a great forgetting of this canon of cultural memory. And we're going to become this very narrow monotheistic view with a violent God at the top of the tree. The Bible tells that story. And then we move from the ritual reform into the scriptural reform with the discovery of the book of Yahweh and then the book of the laws of Yahweh. So this is the Josiah to Ezra story. And we're seeing that there has to be now a canon of literature, a canon of beliefs, a narrative that's controlled from the rebuilt temple. And so it's a power grab. It's a power grab for narrative control. It's a power grab for tithes. It's a power grab for political control, all tied in with the monotheization. Now, that's not my invention. The story's all there in the text. And I think once you've read that storyline, something else that's not frequently preached on, you have to regard everything that went before quite differently. You have to realize this was a different world, whether you want to use the language of polytheism, henotheism, or paleo contact, but it certainly wasn't Yahweh's monotheism.
Yeah, no doubt, which is a problem for a lot of the apologists. The Inveritas, thank you so much for the super chat. Rael has been saying this since his encounter in December 1973 with Yahweh Elohim.
Yes, so I get people from the Raelian movement saying, Paul, you should really be in conversation with us because we're really saying the same things. And there may be overlap between what Raelians say and what I have to say in my books, but I'm not interested in organizations that want to sort of make themselves like an organizational mouthpiece for the new truth. I don't think we want new priesthoods. And I hope I'm not offending anyone by saying this, but I don't want new priesthoods. I'm not interested in new prophets. I'm interested in ideas, in thoughts. I'm not so interested in unsupported statements because someone has heard a voice. Now, I'm not denying that could happen. I'm not denying there could be a contact experience of that kind, but I don't think it's helpful in terms of bringing other people into the conversation. So in my books, I go to texts. I don't go for channeled information. I don't go to new prophets and say, oh, this is what the new prophet said. My book's about going back to ancestral story, to ancient texts. So there is something objective we can all look at together. Yeah. And then I'm happy to talk about translation and interpretation, and I'm happy to speculate. But for me, I have to be grounded in something objective in that way.
So if I may be a bit more rough around the edges here, I've not done a lot of deep research on Rael, but the vibes I got from, some of the footage I've seen, some of the things, it feels culty, and anything that feels culty to me, I'm allergic to.
I run a million miles from. Same. I mean, I do remember when the prophet of Raelianism emerged, and that was my first thought as well, Derek. This is like a new Messiah figure. Yeah. Clearly presenting himself as a prophetic type figure.
Surrounded by cute girls the whole time. I mean,
therefore I'm not interested.
Yeah.
Whatever the ideas are, and they might have, really good ideas there, but I'm just not interested in that kind of organization.
I can't help but think of all the other, I just think of, and I hate to want to put in this category, but in my mind, again, cults, I start thinking of cults that have girls who are groupies surrounding the main guy, and there are things happening, and you know what I'm saying? It just feels like, here we are again. I mean, even the Jesus from Australia. I know you've heard of the Jesus from Australia, right? The Australian Jesus guy?
Not familiar with him.
Oh, I interviewed him a long time ago. I'll send you the interview. You should check it out.
Okay.
He literally claims to be Jesus and that he's here today, right now. And he has a cult in some compound out there in Australia, and he's surrounded by a bunch of women, but the girl that is now his wife, which it wasn't his wife originally, which I've spoke to his original wife before he discovered he was Jesus. I mean, like, I've been knee deep in cults for a while, like learning and discovering. This new wife thinks she's Mary Magdalene. He's convinced her. So it's really sad.
Well,
the new wife was his ex-wife's close friend. Now, I can't speak on Rael. I don't know the guy, but I'm saying, like, when I can't help but judge in my mind a little bit, like, hey, this looks a little funny to me, you know?
Yeah, well, I mean, you and I could do that, couldn't we? You and I could dress all in white. You and I are both charismatic enough that we could create a cult if we wanted to.
Yes.
But for both of us, we're far more interested in sparking people's curiosity so that they can be equipped and encouraged and affirmed as they go on a journey of their own. And I find that is what is needed. We don't need, because as soon as you've got a new prophet or a new Messiah, that's a signal. Again, you don't have to think anymore. Just listen to the oracle. And it comes back to that moment I had with my two pastors where they thought two different things that set me on a totally different track. I'm not looking for prophets. I'm not looking for priests. I'm curious, and I want to spark that curiosity in others.
Yeah, same. So thank you for that super chat. Solera Knight says, what are the cherubim?
Oh, yes, a cruve.
You mind if I run to the restroom real quick while you tell them what your discoveries are?
I was going to ask for your help at this point, actually, Derek.
Oh, you need to go?
I'm trying to remember what I know about cruve and cruvim.
I don't know about the cruvim, but I have an idea about cherubim.
Yeah, it's the same word. It's the same word.
Yeah. From what I recently, I did an interview with a scholar on her book, God's Monsters, where she goes and explains, first of all, this is a ubiquitous concept. It's usually a guardian that is a hybrid being.
Yeah, it is. It seems to be that in some texts, but then in other texts, it seems to be something that an Elohim rides, like a form of transport, whether it's, a creature that he rides, like in Avatar, or like in riding a horse, or whether it's a craft. But it's a lot more mysterious. It's not, when we use it liturgically, we're thinking angels in sheets, and it's certainly not one of those.
Got it. Next super chat, we have Michael Matheson. You were a Christian apologist. Grow some balls. I'm just going to skip from that one, but Michael, thanks for the super chat. Doc Pluralmanat, thank you for the super chat. If you accept A&E borrowing, how do you avoid over systematizing parallels?
Oh, yes.
At what point does influence become reader imposed coherence rather than demonstrable literary dependence? Can I leave you for a second real quick and I'll be right back?
Yep. Okay. Look, that is a really good question. And it's a conversation I have with a lot of people. You cannot directly equivalence fragments of Mesopotamian literature with whole portions of the Bible. It doesn't really work that way. And I mentioned earlier that we've got stories in the Hebrew scriptures that are summary forms of Mesopotamian stories, and one can certainly say that. The way it works is we find similar motifs, storylines, moments, episodes in all those canons. So if we're looking at Sumerian, Babylonian, Akkadian, Assyrian literature, Ugaritic literature, Hebrew literature, you'll be finding stories that overlap, episodes that repeat. But you can't layer this over the top of this and find that everything runs in parallel. It doesn't really work that way. Read the Epic of Gilgamesh and you'll be in this moment and you'll think, whoa, hold a moment, this sounds like something from Genesis 1, and then you go a bit further, or this sounds like something from Genesis 3. And it's more that kind of correlation that we find stories that repeat within both canons. So one is not a direct repeat of the other. And even within the canon of Mesopotamian literature, I don't think you can even systematize that, because Enki or Ea in the Epic of Gilgamesh is not the same character that he is in the myth of Adapa, for instance. He's a different character, different role, doing different things on a different agenda. And you really have to see it more as we've got a smorgasbord of stories across ancient Sumer, Babylonia, Arcadia, and Assyria. And then in the Hebrew scriptures, we've got a smorgasbord of stories. And there are correlations, story to story. But it's not book to book, text to text. And I think we are going to make a lot of mistakes if we try and systematize. So one way this comes up in my correspondence is a lot of people will come to me and they'll say, oh, yes, I've worked this out. Yahweh is Enlil. And I'll say, well, in Genesis 3, Yahweh takes the part that's played by Enlil in the Mesopotamian story. But if you get to Deuteronomy 32, Yahweh's not Enlil there because he's junior to El Elyon, and El Elyon is a figure more similar to Enki. So it just doesn't work that way. You can't make direct equations. We have a kaleidoscope of stories here, a kaleidoscope here. And as you read all of them, you'll realize these stories repeat. They finesse each other, they repeat each other, but it's not an equivalent system to system. Neither should we expect it to be. I mean, remember that the Hebrew scriptures have been through redactions, just as the Epic of Gilgamesh stories have been through redactions, not in their early form. You just can't draw a direct equivalence in that way.
Thank you, Doc. Thank you so much for the super chat. Michael Matheson says, you spent your life in the church and said nothing?
Well, this is somebody who was clearly following my preaching career very closely and has clearly read all of my books.
Yes.
And has summarized them superbly.
That's great. Michael, keep sending in the supers, man. I appreciate it. Bakken again. Thank you, Bakken, for the super chat. One psych in multiplicity, consciousness in all.
Cool.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And then Michael Matheson's back again, says, I'm not sure if I learned anything. Snooze fest.
All right, Michael, I'm really sorry if you've learned nothing from our conversation. So please let me point you to my book, The Eden Conspiracy, because that gives you the real maths behind the ideas that I'm putting forward. And if you can read it at your own pace and, cross-reference and everything, you might get more out of that. So that's The Eden Conspiracy, available at Amazon.
There you go. There you go. Michael, thank you again. Agorist Alex, thanks for the super chat. Stone for J Daddy. And I think this was while we were talking about the
cannibalism oil.
Yeah, Agorist is funny. And then look, he's got a mushroom in there too. That's another conversation, huh?
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you. Michael Matheson again says, withdrawal from alcohol, benzos, and opium is hell. That's true.
Oh gosh, well that is very true. And what I'll say in response to that is, many people on a deconstruction journey, it's very challenging because it can be very isolating. And the fact is, we all need community. Whatever we're going through, we need people around us who love us, who can share the journey with us. And I do find that challenging, that if people are deconstructing their faith, very often it means they lose their support structures. They lose a lot of support from their family. I've lost virtually all my friends through publishing the Eden series, because so many of my friends were church friends, which is something slightly different, where your commonality is built on believing the same things, supporting the same programs. So I really do empathize with you going through that, Michael. I'm sorry you're having to go through it. And yes, I think missing community is a real need in today's world. We're very fragmented, but we need each other as much as we ever have done.
Well said. I definitely agree. And then Michael says, drugs are the opposite of a religious experience. If I may comment on that, because I have quite a track record of addiction, I empathize with this comment from someone who's abused the drugs to the point where they've harmed you. There are many normal people, I call them normies, who don't end up with needles in their veins and overdoses and stuff like me, who did not abuse the alcohol to blackout states, that did not go down really dark paths and didn't know how to escape. So there's a sense in which I get that. But there are times I recall when I did have the ecstatic, very, very, the experience was profound. I don't know how else to put it other than I remember when I had born again experiences, when I had those profound experiences, and that is the closest synonymous kind of experience I could come close to was drug experiences. And I'm not talking about the bad part about drug experiences. I'm talking about the good part. And if they weren't good, we wouldn't have done them to begin with. So, that's my personal opinion for as a recovering addict with almost 11 years off heroin and 12 years off alcohol. So I was dying from both. Thank you so much. William Arons, good to see you, William. It's been a while. I appreciate you being here and super chatting. Rather than souls being assigned to a heaven or hell on their death, do you find the concept of Sheol as a neutral realm of the departed being more prevalent in the Bible?
It's not more prevalent. I think it gets one mention in the Gospels, if I remember correctly. It interests me that many of the early readers of Christian literature, so the early Gospels, canonical, pre-canonical, extra-canonical, were coming from the Greek world. They were coming from the world of international thought as Greek philosophy had sort of encapsulated it. And people coming to that literature from Plato, for instance, who I think encapsulates Greek thought supremely, would be coming with the idea of this material life ending, but our essence as beings of consciousness continuing. But there's a moment between those two forms of existence that included some kind of a life review. And I think that is how many of the early readers would have approached the Christian texts. And rather than like today, we would approach the texts with the church's doctrine of eternal conscious torment in the back of our minds, they would approach these texts with that in the back of their minds. And I find some texts in the New Testament that really seem to be echoes of that kind of thought. Not a Sheol idea where there's this realm where dead people go. I think the closest I can find to that in Plato is Plato's idea that some people might struggle to transition, to go on to the next thing because they've got too much baggage here, whether it's trauma, rage, unforgiveness, unfulfilled ambition, and it can take a while to transition. So he had that notion that people might be caught in some kind of a space. But no, I don't think Sheol in the New Testament is a big thing, to be honest.
Thank you. Yeah. Again, I really appreciate seeing you here, William. It's been a blast. And all these years you've been around, I hope you continue sticking around and get something out of these interviews. Leonard Dozer, forgive me if I butcher your last name. Derek and Paul, you both are a credit to civilization. Do you see any merit in the notion that the Elohim did not create man, but man in their image?
Okay, I think he's missed out a word. And I think he's drawing a distinction between creating man and developing man. I think that's what he's asking about.
Huh.
Yeah, I do that. I think that is an interesting idea because certainly there are narratives around the world. I find them in the Hebrew scriptures. You can find them in the Babylonian stories, Mesoamerican stories, other story around the world that talks about powerful beings coming to our planet in the past and then adapting our ancestors to become better looking and more intelligence or more amenable to existing as a working class for these visitors who've come to colonize. So I mentioned that because a lot of people do get hung up on the idea of Elohim if they were actual beings coming and creating us, and that is not what the stories say, as according to my reading. I think that the stories are talking about finessing us in the way that we've finessed cattle, sheep, dogs. Not a very flattering story, but I think that's how the stories actually run. Now, that's separate to the question of, is this pure fiction, or did something like this actually happen? But it's not a story that leads me to believe that we were created from scratch by some alien species. That's not my view.
Gotcha. So Lara Knight, thank you for the super chat and being a member. Genesis 2:10-12. Gold found in Havilah, Eden, along with bdellium and onyx stone. King declared the Eden mines off limits and ran off all the locals.
Derek, let me throw that question to you.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's something I don't know about.
I've never heard of this, Solera. So this is very interesting to me. I mean, obviously, Eden, if we go back to Dillman, like there are precious stones in all of these very sacred locations. So I do see that in Ezekiel talks about precious stones. I'm not really sure what to do with. I do know that if you go back into the older, not only Canaanite, but the Mesopotamian stuff, the king is significant as well. And there are a lot of people who see Adam kind of in this, like the Eden is like almost like a temple precinct, so to speak, scenario is how a lot of them understand it. So is this king somehow related to Adam in this? I'm not sure. The Eden mines, I don't know what to make of that quote there. The mines of Eden. I mean, there are 4 rivers according to Genesis. Go back to Dillman. There's rivers and there's jewels, onyx, precious stones, all of that kind of stuff. Not sure what to do with all that.
I don't know anything about it, other than to say there is that intriguing phrase about these interesting resources, minerals being near Eden. And when anyone reads Genesis, they have to pause and think, why is that relevant? And it's relevant for reasons I haven't plumbed.
Yeah, there's so much to. I mean, I did a little documentary one time, just going to it called it I had an original title, I changed it. It was like The King and the Tree. And that took me down a rabbit hole. Even going back to, you brought George Smith up, 1800s, and the Adam and Eve sill. I'm sure you've come across the Adam and Eve sill, where he thought that the older story of Adam and Eve was already being depicted on an ancient cylinder sill from 2100 2200 BCE, and modern scholars say no, it's just a common banquet scene of fertility with a devotee across from a deity, and there's a tree in the middle, but the one side looks like a female, the other side looks like it's a male deity with a horn crown reaching for a tree, and there's a snake, I kid you not, behind the female. And George Smith thought this was it. He's like, I found because he was looking for that, and he found enough evidence to know Noah's clearly coming from all this stuff. So I don't know. I mean, all I would say is like Paul said, there's probably riches, and we could be mining in the literal sense more material and figure out more things. In fact, one more thing before I forget, Paul, have you come across this book? I really, here it is. Have you ever read this book? Adam, Eve. Oh, let me bring my Adam, Eve, and the Devil. Oh, talk to me. Keep on talking, because I think I pulled my plug. What did I do? What the heck did I do? I think I mute. Oh, there we go.
Is this better?
That's better.
I knocked my microphone. So no, it's not a book I've read yet. I may need to add it to my reading list.
You got to get it. There's an ancient cylinder sill. They claim that the Adam and Eve story in Canaan, I'm telling you, I would not steer you wrong. You got to check this out. There was a god, Haranu, in Underworld. figure that had turned into a serpent. The character in the Canaanite story, his name is Adamu. Adamu, like literally.
Sounds familiar.
It sounds familiar. Anyway, you got to check it out. All right. Enough about that. I don't want to keep you forever. So Michael Madison, thank you again. It says Archbishop, my apologies.
Oh, that's nice. And a gift.
A gift.
That's so sweet. I should clarify Archdeacon, which is one down from a bishop, whereas Archbishop is one up from a bishop.
Either way.
But it's funny. I do like to mention the Archdeacon thing because it's just a way of getting people's attention to the fact that my journey has been from the world of ministry. It has been from the world of faith. And it is unusual for someone to have served at that level in the church to be saying the kind of things I'm saying, to be turning around and saying, I think we've misunderstood, we've misread many of the stories in the Hebrew canon. We probably misunderstood many in the New Testament as well. And to be willing to really run with that. And I just find it helps people who are on a deconstruction journey from the world of faith. So when I say Archdeacon, it's not really I'm wanting to go, showing all my medals and boasting. I just want to catch people and draw them into the conversation.
Yeah. Michael, thank you again. Good sport. Thank you for the positive super chat there. Solera Knight, who sent the last super chat, followed up with a place noted for high quality gold, aromatic resin, bdellium, and onyx stone. These verses highlight the abundance and resources in Eden. The Lord took over Eden, pushed out the locals. It still happens to this very day. So that's what they're getting at, I guess. I'm not 100% sure what to do with the mining of, where that is, because where's Eden exactly?
That's a great question.
That's yes. Probably you probably discussed some of this stuff in your book, huh?
I discussed that in my book, The Invasion of Eden. I think it's Ezekiel that talks about the garden of the powerful ones being in the high country of the powerful ones. And I'm coming to the view that the high country that keeps getting referenced means the Armenian highlands. And I argue also in The Invasion of Eden that is where Abraham, or the Abraham tradition, came from as well, not in lower Mesopotamia, but in the Armenian highlands. There are many vectors that point there and say that's really the beginning of our very interesting stories of human history. So I look in that direction.
Up here, like near the Caucasus Mountains, kind of.
So literally in the Ararat region.
Got it. Okay.
Because it's not just the Noah tradition that talks about that.
Right.
It's identified on the oldest map in the world that talks about Ziusudra. You've got a very long established tradition around hike that ties in with the Noah story. And there are geographical clues that the Abraham story emerges from there as well. And it's only logical that someone who's a descendant of Noah, part of the Noah tradition, would be in that same region. But for all my reasoning, go to The Invasion of Eden, and I spell it out in detail.
Yeah, it makes me think of the Song of Uli Kumi and some of the Hittite stuff that also derives from that same. I mean, there's just a deep, rich past up there. So awesome. Okay. PLWK, thank you for the super chat. Question 1, back then, did you have respond to a jibe? The Anglican COE tradition was founded on the bed of Henry VIII. If so, what's your response? Question 2, what's the Achilles heel of Christianity? Thanks.
Well, look, I'm not a huge fan of Henry VIII as a person, particularly the way he treated his wives and other staff. He was a pretty brutal kind of guy. But I think fundamentally England wanted to be a sovereign nation. And when they came to the crisis around the succession and Henry's inability to produce a male heir and his desire to replace his first wife with a second wife, who he hoped would bring him a male heir. What put the kibosh on all that was that England was not sovereign. It needed permission for all that stuff from a pope who at that time was really under the power of England's arch rival, Spain. So there was a lot of geopolitics all mixed in with what was going on at the time. And really the only way England could move forward as a sovereign nation was to break with Rome. And, geopolitically, it was absolutely the right thing to do. I'd even say theologically, it was a good move. I think we get distracted by the marriage issue. It's really much, much bigger than that. Who's in charge of England? Is it the King of England, or is it a bishop in Rome, is what it really boiled down to. So I think it's unfair to make too much of a Mickey Mouse of the issue. It was messy, but, history is history. That's what happened. The reformers obviously seized the opportunity to move theological reform forward. But yes, there was some untidy politics behind it all. What's the Achilles heel of Christianity? It depends. Well, this will sound so feeble, but it depends what you mean by Christianity, because I describe myself as a Christian. I have a belief in God. I seek to be a follower of the teachings of Jesus. Is that Christianity? If we're talking about Christianity as a collection of the traditional dogmas, I think maybe the Achilles heel is really in the nature of the texts on which those doctrines are built. If we have misunderstood the nature of the Gospels within the Greco-Roman world, then we're building on sand. If we have misunderstood the nature and meaning of the Hebrew scriptures within the Bible, and we're building our theology on that, then again, we're building on a foundation of sand. It's funny, when I was at theological college, I went to a college, St. John's, Nottingham, and it had been founded in the 1800s as an alternative to the Oxford-Cambridge monopoly that had produced priests for the Church of England previously. And it was a response to a long period where it was believed that if you wanted to be a priest and teach Christianity, all you needed was a classics degree from Oxford or Cambridge. You didn't even need to read theology, just a classics degree. Because if you understood Greco-Roman literature, then you'd know how to read the Gospels. And I now look back and think, actually, there's something in that. There really is something in that. And I think the college I went to was part of a 180-degree move away from that, so that when I did my theology, we didn't study any Greco-Roman literature. And I think that was really the Achilles heel of the systematic theology I was imbibing. And I've had to come much later to reading the family of narratives of which the Christian documents are a part, and reading the Ugaritic stories and reading the Mesopotamian stories. I really should have done that at the beginning, and I'm doing things back to front. So I think misunderstanding what the texts are can only mean we're building our doctrines on sand. I think that's the Achilles heel.
Yeah, I would just, and this was a question geared to you, but I would add to what you just said and simply say, I think the text of the New Testament themselves, critically analyzed, if Christianity didn't anchor itself to like a specific dogma of these texts, and I say Christianity as in the traditional forms that have ultimately dominated, they have shot themselves in the hill, not in the foot. They've shot themselves in the hill, because all you got to do is just analyze the texts. And I think when you start analyzing the text, you start finding out the flaws that don't work for their system. If you're not attaching your faith to this material, then okay, like in that manner, you might glean it for wisdom or something like that. You have a much more freedom in which you engage with the material. But when you start to have such staunch, almost apologetic argumentations, there's so many issues, in my opinion, that you could approach this from, that the whole to me, the whole thing crumbles down for that. So you want to rip all that down and just get to the bare teachings and sayings and stuff that are inspirational for me. Okay, go for it. But yeah, there's just a lot I could add to that. And I don't want to keep you long. Michael is back again, says 2 great minds, 200 broke viewers. Pay these guys. Michael's funny.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks, Michael.
For sure.
I really appreciate the support. Okay, I feel like I'm coming in now. Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay. Making sure my thing. Michael's funny tonight. Michael's funny. Leonard Dozer, again, thank you for the super chat. Paul, are you familiar with the work of Gene Sendy? If not, very early paleo contact scientist and thinker, won't regret it.
Yeah, Leonard. Well, first of all, thank you for that donation to Derek's channel, and it's great to see you here today. I am not familiar with the work of Gene Sendy, if I'm saying it correctly. So another book for my list, and thank you for flagging it for me. I will note it down.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's we caught up. I'm making sure. Don't want to leave anybody hanging. Yeah. Absolutely. We caught up. That's awesome. Paul, you've been a champ. You kicked butt. I had a blast. Nobody could say that I don't hang out with people who are believers. That's for sure. But at the end of the day, I don't think any of the apologists, I don't know a single apologist I know online who would probably consider you a believer. And what do you have to say to that, Paul? I mean, what do you think about that? That there's you gotta.
That's fine. Look, they're happy to run with their definition of faith or Christianity or being a believer. That's fine. Each to their own. I'm not going to take offense.
Hey, well, listen, I get called I was never one to begin with all the time.
Oh, yes. Oh, same. Because actually having a belief in God and seeking to follow the teachings of Jesus is not enough for a lot of people. You have to agree with their theology as well. And if you don't agree, then you could never have been a believer. And I can tell them about my powerful experiences and they'll say, yes, but it can't have been authentic. You can't have a conversation about that. So I just have to say, that's fine. I'm not offended.
Absolutely. Look, I know what it's like. And that for that, I just try to have a little empathy and continue my work and continue yours. So Paul, we're at the end of the 2 hours, 3 hours. How did we go so long?
Is that, I can't see my clock. I didn't realize that. Wow.
3 hours. That was one of the smoothest conversations.
Oh my goodness.
Oh my. Look, for that, if you love what we do, if you love what Paul does, I can't believe this was 3 hours. That blew by because I got to do some more narrating for a script. I paused to come and do this actually, and I was like, oh, I'm going to go tonight and do some more. It's 10 o'clock here, right, at PM.
Wow.
You have several books on Amazon. People can go get it. I think you're not only a charming, wonderful human being, Paul, but I also think you're very bright and you have a lot of insight. And you, in my opinion, like I look at it as harm reduction, and I know you as a human being just want to help people, find their own journey, find their own path, and enjoy doing this. And I think you're into that same fun, deep research and mystery of life and all that. So anyone who likes what we're doing here, you can go get Paul's books, paperback, or you're on Audible too, right?
I'm only on Audible for Escaping from Eden. The other books are paperback and Kindle, except for the last two, because I've had massive piracy, unfortunately, of my books. But you'll find them all at Amazon. And the order, just to tell people, is Escaping from Eden, The Scars of Eden, Echoes of Eden, The Eden Conspiracy, which really shows all the maths, The Invasion of Eden, and The Eden Enigma, where we're in the Armenian highlands exploring.
You got me wanting to read these, Paul. Maybe we dive deeper into some of this stuff.
You will come away enriched.
Yeah, I enjoyed this. I enjoyed our conversation. My audio keeps being funky. I wonder if I can
still hear you.
Hey, also you have the YouTube channel. I put the YouTube channel in the description.
On YouTube, it's The Fifth Kind and the Paul Wallis channel. And if you want to go deep diving, come to ancientknowledgeacademy.com. If you want to come to Turkey with me to go to these sites, get into the carvings that tell the ancient stories, it's ancientknowledgetours.com.
Paul, do me a favor. Send me all the links. I'll copy and paste them in the description. You're not only a gentleman, a friend. I respect you. I appreciate you. And it has been a heck of a ride. This has been a blast. I sure hope we do this again in the future. And M.R. Anderson left a big super chat here at the end just to say, Paul and Derek in one video. This is certainly a video for the ages. Keep up the great work.
Awesome. Derek, thanks for having me on. It's been a real pleasure. I am an admirer of your channel. I love the work you do. And it's been fun having this conversation with you.
One day we may meet in person, my friend.
Oh, we've got to do that. Yeah, come to Australia.
Exactly. Hey, if you ever come to Florida and you're interested in hitting up Danny Jones or whatever, or any of the podcasters down there, Matt Bill, who owns the Bill, literally it's like a JC Penney's. He's the owner of the Bill. If you ever drive down anywhere in America, I don't know if they're outside of it. There's the big, I don't know what it is, a clothing store like Bill's. He owns it. It's a podcast. Danny Jones is down here. There's a couple different people. If you ever make a visit through Florida, please don't forget to let me know. You can crash land here. And
nice. Oh, thanks, Derek. That'll be great. I will look forward to it.
Awesome. Everybody, like the video, share the video, grab his books, subscribe, and never forget, we are Myth Vision.
Son, do you want to know what the truth is? After this, there's no turning back. You take the blue pill and you wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to. You take the red pill and you stay in Wonderland, and I show you just how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.